Putin thought he was getting a loyal army. Instead, he got a deadly mutiny. Russia's so-called alliance with North Korea has taken a shocking turn. After sending up to 12,000 North Korean troops to help in Russia's Kursk counteroffensive, Putin expected unwavering support. Instead, some of the troops have turned their guns on the very Russian soldiers they were sent to fight alongside. On January 22nd, news broke that 3 North Korean soldiers had killed their Russian comrades and vanished. Now, a massive manhunt is underway. But why would North Korean troops, handpicked by Kim Jong-un, suddenly start killing Russian forces? Were they desperate, betrayed, or is there something bigger going on in this so-called alliance? In this video, we're breaking down what really happened, what it means for Putin and Kim, and whether this is just the beginning of a much bigger problem. Let's start with the manhunt. On January 22nd, Radio Free Asia, or RFA, was among the first to report that 3 North Korean soldiers are wanted for killing 5 of their Russian comrades on the Kursk battlefield. The report was accompanied by a picture of a wanted notice that contained a trio of facial composite drawings of the North Koreans in question. That notice was shared by the Telegram channel Dossier Spiona, along with an explanation that the trio is currently being hunted and is classified as armed and dangerous by the Russian military. The poster itself explains the North Koreans' supposed crime. "Koreans killed servicemen of the Russian armed forces," blares its headline. On January 13, 2025, in the area of the village of Bolshoye Soldatskoye, Kursk region, 3 DPRK or Democratic People's Republic of Korean soldiers killed 5 servicemen of the 810th Separate Marine Brigade, Military Unit 13140 from Sevastopol. That's interesting information. The 810th Separate Marine Brigade was formed in 1967 and has been a nearly ever-present force in the Ukraine war. When Ukraine invaded Kursk, the brigade was one of the first that Putin sent to counter the threat, leading to it being badly battered as it came up against more prepared Ukrainian forces. Forbes reported in December 2024 that the 2,500-soldier brigade was finally being rotated out of service once Putin launched his full Kursk counteroffensive. It was high time that happened. The brigade, along with Russia's 155th Naval Infantry Brigade, had spent months conducting failed and undermanned assaults against Ukraine's soldiers in Kursk. The 155th had even been destroyed and rebuilt several times, claims the outlet, with the 810th likely being in no better condition. It's likely that the brigade lost both of its 400-person battalions back in November when it attacked a Ukrainian garrison in Pogrebki, for instance. Why does this matter? Well, the 810th Separate Marine Brigade wasn't involved in active operations in Kursk at the time 5 of its members were killed by North Korean soldiers. They were meant to be resting. This means the North Koreans stationed with them also wouldn't have been on the front lines. Their killings weren't out of immediate desperation so they could try to escape the fighting. Rather, they may have been premeditated and engineered to give the 3 North Korean soldiers a chance to get away before the 810th was redeployed in Kursk. Coming back to the wanted poster, RFA claims that it says the North Korean soldiers are armed and dangerous. If found, the poster reads, observe personal safety measures and report to the Kursk Regional Department of the Ministry of Internal Affairs. It sounds like the poster is telling any rank-and-file Russian soldiers not to engage with the North Korean troops, a wise precaution, seeing as those soldiers apparently managed to kill 5 of Russia's finest Marines. The poster also claims that the North Koreans may be moving as a group in the territories of the Kursk, Belgorod, Bryansk, and Oryol regions. That tells us that Russia has been slow off the mark when it comes to tracking these rebellious soldiers down, especially if they've managed to make it out of Kursk entirely while being on foot. Now, there are caveats to this report. RFA quotes Spy Dossier as claiming that the report and wanted poster come from a reliable source. However, RFA hasn't been able to independently verify that the poster is real. That raises the possibility of it being a forgery, perhaps a deception created by Ukraine in its never-ending propaganda war with Putin, and that the North Korean soldiers aren't actually wanted. But what if they are? What would have even caused them to kill their Russian comrades in the first place? The UK's Metro newspaper notes that no motive for the killing has been established. Russian authorities are apparently trying to cover up the whole ordeal, informing only the soldiers in Kursk who may be affected and not breathing a word of the massacre to the Russian people. That makes sense. Putin has been cagey about the arrival of North Korean soldiers in his country since October 2024, with neither he nor North Korean President Kim Jong-un acknowledging their presence. Russia is playing games with these soldiers, letting the rest of the world draw its own conclusions without confirming anything one way or the other. So it stands to reason that Russia would like to keep this manhunt for 3 North Korean soldiers under wraps, because confirming that it's happening would equate to stating that there are North Korean soldiers fighting alongside Russians in Kursk. So we have no word about motives. However, RFA is willing to speculate. It says that there's a possibility that all of this is one massive misunderstanding. The North Koreans didn't massacre their Russian Marine comrades purposefully. RFA says that some military bloggers are already speculating that the deaths of the 5 Russians may have been due to a friendly fire incident caused by the language barrier that exists between the Russian soldiers and their North Korean counterparts. The language barrier has been highlighted as a potentially major problem ever since North Korean forces arrived in Kursk. In November 2024, NBC reported that the United States believes that this barrier, combined with the North Korean soldiers' collective inexperience, would make any sort of cohesion between the two groups difficult to form. The average Russian soldier is going to say, "What are they doing here?" said former US National Intelligence Officer for North Korea Sidney Seiler. "I'm having to hold their hand. I'm tripping over their bodies," is the attitude Seiler believes the Russians have taken to their North Korean comrades. That attitude would start any relationship off on a bad foot. If the Russian soldiers didn't want the North Koreans there in the first place, they're certainly not going to make much effort to overcome the language barrier issues that exist between them. That combination of Russian skepticism and language barriers exacerbates the fact that the North Korean soldiers have entered a completely new environment in Kursk. Even the best of them have still spent their entire lives in an isolated country, completely cut off from the rest of the world, while having gained no real battle experience. Throwing them into Kursk and the front lines of raging fighting between Ukraine and Russia could show Russia that these soldiers aren't viable. That's the opinion of South Korean Defense Minister Kim Yong-hyun, who believes that this inexperience had led to Russia treating the North Korean soldiers as though they're expendable. Kim Jong-un is selling North Korean soldiers as cannon fodder mercenaries, Kim claimed in October 2024. There certainly seems to be little effort to integrate the two sets of soldiers. Petro Hadayshuk, who's a sergeant major in Ukraine's 80th Independent Air Assault Brigade, claims that captured Russians in Kursk have revealed that they generally have no contact at all with their North Korean comrades. Firstly, due to the language barrier, says Hadayshuk, lending credence to RFA's suggestion that language issues may have been to blame for the North Korean massacre. Secondly, the North Koreans live, eat, and conduct their activities completely separately from the Russian occupiers. They have no joint operations except for combat. The North Koreans' task, according to the captured occupiers, was exclusively assault operations, while the Russians were meant to secure the positions in case of success, added the Ukrainian senior sergeant. Those comments potentially throw a whole new light on what happened with the 3 North Korean soldiers. Perhaps they weren't stationed with the 810th Separate Marine Brigade at all. Instead, they were operating on their own. Language barriers had prevented them from receiving proper orders, so they were on the lookout for anybody who seemed vaguely Ukrainian. The 5 Marines who died at their hands may have been mistaken by the North Koreans for Ukrainian soldiers. Only after sifting through identification papers would they have realized their collective mistake, leading them to going on the run rather than facing up to the consequences of their actions. It's a possibility. After all, this wouldn't be the first time that North Korean troops have accidentally attacked their Russian comrades. On December 14, 2024, the Kyiv Independent reported that North Korean soldiers fighting in Kursk had accidentally opened fire on their Russian comrades. The news came via the HUR Telegram channel, which said that the North Koreans were actively involved in combat in the Kursk Oblast when they came across members of the Chechen Akhmat unit. That unit isn't part of the Russian military but is fighting alongside it as a paramilitary force. The North Koreans didn't know that. Language barriers may have again been a factor and opened fire. The result? An attack that killed 8 of the Russia-friendly soldiers. LBC offered more details. It claims that the unit of North Korean soldiers was already fearful when they came across a set of Russian vehicles being used by the Chechen Akhmat. That fear may have led them to firing before thinking, as it appears they mistook those vehicles for Ukrainian mechanized units advancing on their position. So the North Koreans at least proved they had some level of combat effectiveness in the encounter. Only they did so by killing soldiers who were likely approaching to join them in whatever assault against Ukraine they had planned next. Perhaps that same thing happened in January. 3 North Korean soldiers mistook Russian Marines for Ukrainian enemies and opened fire, killing 5 before realizing what they'd done. Terrified over what that mistake might mean for them, they ran instead of reporting the incident, sparking the Russian manhunt. That's one possible scenario. However, there is another way all of this might have happened. Language barriers and friendly fire may have had nothing to do with the massacre of the 5 soldiers from the 810th Separate Marine Brigade. It could simply have been a case of the North Korean soldiers having enough of their mistreatment at the hands of the Russians, leading them to take revenge in the only way they know how, killing them so they could escape. There are plenty of breadcrumbs that could lead us to that possible motive. RFA provides one in its report on the wanted poster by pointing out that North Korean soldiers in Kursk have been complaining about receiving insufficient rations. The Defense Post also reported on the issue in December 2024, noting that Ukraine's main Directorate of Intelligence had highlighted how many of the North Korean soldiers were now suffering from malnutrition due to not receiving enough food for their daily operations. Russia attempted a solution. It sent a deputy commander in its resource support division to figure out what to do, with that commander eventually deciding to restock the North Korean food supplies with rations taken from the food reserves of Russia's airborne assault brigades. RFA provides more details, claiming that the commander was Major General Mevlyutov, who serves in the Leningrad military district. He supposedly pulled reserve rations from the 11th Air Assault Brigade. These food problems seem to spread throughout the North Korean units stationed in Kursk. According to Mikhailo Makaruk, who serves with Ukraine's 8th Special Operations Regiment, most of the North Korean soldiers killed in Kursk barely have any equipment to speak of. He says they're typically provided with a couple of low-quality grenades and medical kits, but it's rare to find food among the supplies those soldiers have. Russia simply isn't feeding its North Korean soldiers enough. But there's a little twist to this malnutrition tale. Guess whose command the dissatisfied North Korean soldiers were under at the time of their complaints about rations? The 810th Separate Marine Brigade. The very brigade that has 5 murdered soldiers is the one under which the wanted North Koreans were serving. That raises many new possibilities. Perhaps the North Koreans were actually stationed with the 810th and they felt that it was their supposed comrades who were withholding food intended for them. Starvation may have led to desperation, with the North Koreans choosing to kill the Marines to get their hands on some food before they hightailed it into the Kursk wilderness. Russia's willingness to allow its North Korean soldiers to starve may have come back to bite it, with those North Korean soldiers choosing to murder to get their hands on food no matter what happens to them in the future. It's another possibility. And it's one that's backed by the fact Russia seems to be treating its North Korean soldiers as expendable. You may remember Kim Jong-un's claim that Russia is using its North Korean soldiers as cannon fodder to soak up Ukrainian ammunition before Russia's forces storm in. That's backed up by Petro Haidashuk's comments about the North Koreans typically being the first sent into assaults on Ukrainian positions, with Russian soldiers only following up if the North Koreans happen to succeed. It all adds up to Russia treating its North Korean comrades as though they are lesser. And there's plenty of evidence to suggest that that sort of attitude is running rampant in the Russian military. The Korea Times reported on this issue in its January 17th recap of South Korean Ambassador Hwang Jung-kook's remarks at the United Nations Security Council meeting. Hwang said that Russia has taken a cynical approach to the North Korean soldiers it's received from Kim Jong-un, with most of them being treated as expendable. Hwang even has testimony to back that claim. The testimonies of 2 North soldiers recently captured by Ukraine's military in the Kursk region clearly demonstrates that the North Korean troops are engaged in combat and being dissipated as expendables, he told the council. And it gets worse. North Korean soldiers are apparently being used as human mine detectors, according to the South Korean ambassador. The North Korean soldiers used old-fashioned human wave tactics and were then chased and attacked by Ukrainian drones, he told the Security Council. According to the reports, they were even crossing landmine fields in a single column, 3 to 4 meters apart, like human mine detectors without cover or mine-clearing vehicles. There's also the possibility that the North Korean soldiers sent to Russia were tricked into fighting in Kursk. That also comes from 2 captives Hwang mentioned in his remarks. On January 11th, Radio Liberty reported on those captured North Koreans. One of them, supposedly born in 2005, told the Ukrainians that he thought he was going for training, not to fight a war against Ukraine. In other words, the North Koreans fighting on the front lines in Kursk were never meant to be there in the first place. They were supposed to be learning from Russia's soldiers, at least that's what they were told, but they're now starving, being used to soak up Ukrainian ammunition in human wave attacks, and blowing themselves up, looking for mines, because Russia won't provide them with any equipment they need. The reports keep on coming. On January 13th, the Chosun Daily also reported on the pair of captured North Korean soldiers. It revealed one of the soldiers confirmed the complete lack of food that Kim Jong-un's troops had to deal with. The wounded soldiers revealed that they often went 4 to 5 days without food or water. The same outlet notes that many North Korean soldiers chose death ahead of being captured, with some even going so far as to commit suicide when it becomes clear that Ukraine has won a battle against them. Those decisions are likely made out of fear of what might happen to their families back home, with those families also being forced to live in silence should their loved ones not make it back from Kursk. Reports suggest they're being coerced into signing pledges that they won't speak about the deaths of any soldiers, meaning those in Kursk are not only there under false pretense, if the captured North Korean soldiers are to be believed, but they won't even be remembered by their country if they die. And many of them will die. Hwang Jung-kook says that South Korea's casualty assessments suggest that at least 300 of North Korea's 12,000 soldiers have already died in Kursk, with a further 2,700 being injured. That's about a quarter of the total force, and you have to believe the North Koreans remaining in the oblast are paying attention. Bringing all of this back to the 3 North Koreans accused of murdering 5 Russian Marines, think about the situation in which they found themselves. Starving to the point where they complained about the lack of food available, those soldiers may not have known that they were being sent to Russia to fight. They thought they were stationed with the 810th Separate Marine Brigade to train and learn about the tactics Russia was using against Ukraine. Already racked by hunger, perhaps they had to watch as their supposed Russian comrades sent their fellow North Koreans to die. ill-fated human wave assault cut those soldiers down in droves, while Russian forces stood back and waited to mop up. People those 3 murderous soldiers may have known might also have been among those used to clear up the minefields on foot with no equipment to help with the job. They'd been lied to, starved, used as cannon fodder by a Russian military that doesn't even want them there and has no interest in communicating with them. Those sound like a strong collection of motives for murder. Whatever the case, be it a friendly fire incident or premeditated murder, it's clear that not all is rosy in the alliance Russia has formed with North Korea. Our final question is simple. What will these North Korean soldiers killing their Russian comrades mean for the relationship Putin has formed with Kim? The sad answer is not a lot. Putin has shown throughout the Ukraine war that he's more than willing to feed his own people into the meat grinder to get what he wants. It's that approach that has led to over 835,000 Russians dying, getting injured or being captured on the battlefield in 3 years of fighting, according to Ukraine's Ministry of Finance. Losing 5 more won't mean much to Putin because those soldiers, even though they were Marines, were likely to die anyway. As for Kim, he treats the soldiers he sends to Kursk with the same callous disregard they face when they arrive in Russia. He's likely already lying to them about why they're being sent to Kursk in the first place, meaning he doesn't care whether they're prepared or not. The mistreatment that may have driven these 3 North Korean soldiers to murder also won't mean a lot to him. After all, he's getting money, access to Russian military technology, and an ally in his efforts to work around the United Nations sanctions against his country. Plus, any soldiers who happen to make it back from Kursk will come back with direct combat experience, which is something that's sorely lacking in the North Korean military. Russia will want to capture the murderers as much to show the other North Korean soldiers in Kursk what will happen when they step out of line as they will for enacting any sort of justice. Kim simply won't care. But what do you think about the North Korean soldiers turning against their Russian comrades? Was it a case of friendly fire, or were the North Koreans motivated to murder by rampant mistreatment? Putin's latest plan to turn the tide in Ukraine? Calling on North Korean troops. Yep, after running out of his own seasoned fighters, he's enlisting soldiers from North Korea, where military experience often involves shoveling fields. The plan is to disguise them as Russian soldiers and hope no one notices. But here's the kicker. Some North Korean soldiers are reportedly defecting to Ukraine before they even fire a shot for Russia. Could this desperate alliance be Putin's final misstep, one that ends up arming his enemy instead? And why is North Korea risking its own resources for Putin in the first place? The answer lies in a closer look at how Pyongyang benefits from a weakened Russia. According to the Kiel Institute for the World Economy, NATO countries have provided close to $240 billion in aid from the start of the war in February 2022 to the end of August 2024. The $240 billion is split between direct economic aid and donations in weapons, ammunition, equipment, or training the Ukrainian troops. In fact, the amount spent on Ukraine by NATO closely approximates the combined Russian military budget for the past 3 years. And the results from those donations have been nothing but impressive. During the first half of 2024, Russia has failed to make significant progress in Ukraine on practically every front. The summer invasion of Kharkiv was an utter failure, resulting in Russia losing as many as 70,000 troops in under 2 months. The supposedly modern T-14 Armata tanks have proven to be no match for drone warfare and long-range tactics that both countries have developed and used extensively throughout the conflict. But perhaps the biggest event in the war happened at the beginning of August, when Ukraine decided to go on the offensive for the first time. Initially, with only a few hundred soldiers, the Ukrainian military crossed the border into the Russian Kursk region and started occupying territory. Although the Kremlin quickly insisted the invaders would be dealt with swiftly, the reality was the exact opposite. Russia essentially was completely unprepared for Ukraine managing to get beyond its borders. While Putin threatened a nuclear response if Ukraine fired NATO weapons at Russian territory, one of his security red lines, Ukraine managed to get into Kursk without firing any of the donated weapons. When Russia failed to mount a timely response, the message was clear. Putin was bluffing all along. This created significant issues for Russia. Throughout their war effort, most of Russia's military focus was getting as many contract soldiers outfitted and ready for frontline combat. This meant that the other available soldiers Russia could use, conscripts, were left high and dry. According to interviews with some of the prisoners of war captured in Kursk, the Russian military gave them only a few weeks of basic combat training before shipping them to their posts in the border region. But why didn't Russia want to use their conscripts? After all, the country's mandatory service system has brought in roughly 130,000 conscripts per year on a rotating 6-month system. The answer lies in Russian law. You see, after the catastrophic war the Soviet Union had with Afghanistan in the 1980s, the death toll of the 10-year conflict soared to millions, including a large number of conscripts. Internal pressure caused the Soviet Union to declare that conscripts would no longer be deployed abroad. The Russian Federation kept the law when it inherited the Union. This means that no matter how many conscripts the Russian military has, their role is purely defensive. And because of that, they've not been trained and equipped nearly as much as enlisted soldiers. This fact led to Russia mounting a counter-offensive on Kursk about a month after the initial Ukrainian invasion. Far too little and too late. Even worse, with Russia needing to use its undertrained conscripts and divest some of its resources from the front line, it hasn't managed to push the Ukrainians out of Kursk. By mid-October, reports from the Russian armed forces suggest that only half of the occupied territory has been recaptured. This glacial progress meant that between 120,000 and 200,000 Russians remain forcibly displaced from the Kursk region, potentially escalating problems for the Russian government. The dire situation in Kursk sent Putin searching for answers. One possible solution was to try to leverage other countries to help them more directly, which is precisely where North Koreans come in. North Korea is one of the few countries that has been a long-term ally of both Russia and China, which are in an alliance themselves. Throughout the Russian war effort, North Korea has surged in importance, and for a few good reasons. You see, North Korea has been practically raised from the ground up by Chinese and Russian donations, military aid, and economic aid. Most of the country's military equipment has its roots in Soviet weapons, which it has either used as is or modified. Additionally, the country has relatively advanced ballistic missile and artillery munition production systems, owing to the fact that long-range warfare is practically the only way for it to stay a relevant threat to its southern neighbor. North Korea has attempted more than 30 missile launches in 2023 and a record 64 tests in 2022. Roughly half of those launches were complete failures. The missiles presumably lack any meaningful firepower and defensive capabilities, so there's not quite a reason to worry just yet. But it has still made the country one of the most prolific ballistic missile testers. In fact, North Korea's ability to manufacture weapons and ammunition compatible with Russian platforms is a possible worry. While Russia has proved that its military is not quite at the technological level it needs to be to seriously threaten NATO, one of its best assets is its artillery technology. The most modern self-propelled artillery platforms, like the 2S-19, blow their Western counterparts out of the water in pretty much every respect. For one, Russian weapons typically have a much better sustained fire rate, with the newest designs aiming for roughly 10 rounds per minute. For reference, Western weapons typically achieve around 4 to 6 rounds per minute. Second, Russia has been stockpiling its artillery for years, and it's one of their few weapon types that hasn't gone obsolete nearly as fast as others. Considering that some estimates suggest that Russia lost up to 20,000 artillery pieces over the war, but still has plenty of them left, it's easy to see why large numbers might be working for the strategy. When you have enough artillery lined up, you don't have to be terribly precise or have top-notch armor-piercing rounds. A steady barrage of artillery raining onto the battlefield will render Ukrainian troops unable to mount a serious counteroffensive. This tactic is precisely one of the major reasons why Russia has been able to maintain control over the occupied territory in Donbass and slowly push inward, even at a glacial pace. The Ukrainian military might have more advanced weapons, and its ingenious use of kamikaze drones might be able to take out artillery, but the numbers are working in Russia's favor, at least for now. But despite both sides getting the same drones from China, the country is also lending its anti-drone technology to Russia. Meanwhile, Ukrainian drones have a terrible success rate, with roughly only 1 in 10 drones making it to its target, and that leaves Russia's artillery free to wreak havoc across the battlefield. This brings us back to North Korea, which has ramped up its production capacities to manufacture artillery rounds that Russian weapons can use. A South Korean report from February 2024 suggested that North Korea may have sent Russia as many as 9 million 152mm artillery shells in the previous 6 months, and there's no reason to believe that trade has stopped, or that there aren't shipments to Russia that were unaccounted for previously. Simply put, North Korea has allowed Russia to stay relevant in the war by enhancing one of its few advantages. But what does North Korea get out of the deal? While the agreements between Russia, China, and North Korea are not publicized, it's safe to say that the most likely scenario is Russia sending food supplies and other vital items to North Korea in return. If that wasn't enough, North Korea and Russia signed a mutual defense pact in June this year, vowing to defend each other's borders. At the time, this was only a blip on the radar of world news, considering that neither country was actually territorially threatened. But then the aforementioned invasion of Kursk happened. Ostensibly, Putin is now leveraging that as an opportunity to bring North Korea even deeper into the war. To that end, a South Korean report from October 15th suggested that 3,000 troops were spotted being moved from North Korea to Russia, presumably to be deployed somewhere in its territory. A subsequent report by Ukrainian intelligence has increased the number of troops to 10,000. Additional reports have suggested that the first batch of North Korean troops would contain up to 12,000. And where are all these people going to be deployed? Yes, you guessed it, Kursk. With Putin insisting the invasion means that Russian territory is threatened, rather than invoking one of his red lines that he says justifies the use of nuclear weapons, employing North Korea seems to be a middle ground solution. An infusion of 50,000 or more soldiers in Kursk would allow the Russian military to get a reprieve from combat in that region. Essentially, Russia plans to use North Korean troops for its defensive measures in border regions. This plan has a few major flaws, but let's first discuss the actual state of the troops that North Korea is sending to Russia. One of the ways that North Korea has been able to project any kind of military threat to South Korea in the past decades was due to the country's frankly overzealous mandatory military service requirements. North Korean men are required to serve in the nation's military for up to 8 years, while women serve for 5 years. These requirements are somewhat of an improvement from a few years ago when men had to be in the country's military for a full decade. The mandatory conscription means that North Korea keeps a standing army of around 1.3 million soldiers, which is practically on par with the US armed forces in terms of manpower. Additionally, some reports suggest that North Korea can conscript roughly 8 million people into the army on short notice in the event of a large-scale conflict. These numbers indicate that the 10,000 to 12,000 troops that North Korea has sent to Russia so far are practically a drop in the bucket compared to what it could send. This means that Russia might receive more and more soldiers as time goes on. But as mentioned, there are a few issues with this. First, while North Korea keeps a large standing army, its military is based on Soviet-era practices, and it's assumed that most of its equipment is decades behind modern Western or even Russian militaries. While North Korea and South Korea are technically still involved in the Korean War, actual fighting stopped in 1953 when the armistice of the North Korean War was signed. After that, North Korea became increasingly isolated from the rest of the world, keeping its relations confined to its closest allies like China and Russia. Therefore, the country's military doesn't have any real-life combat experience, and the only people in the country who did died a long time ago. This means that even if the soldiers North Korea sends to Russia are the cream of the crop of its country's military, that bar is so low that the soldiers are unlikely to fare much better than Russian conscripts anyway. North Korean defectors in South Korea have claimed that the average soldier suffers from food shortages, malnutrition, and possibly a lack of modern combat training. Secondly, the soldiers that North Korea has sent are unlikely to speak any Russian, which is primarily used in the Russian military. This creates a potentially insurmountable communication barrier between them and the native Russian forces. The reports of North Korean movements suggest that around 500 officers and 3 generals have joined the troops. Additionally, Ukrainian intelligence intercepting Russian communication suggests that there should be 1 interpreter and 3 officers per 30 soldiers that North Korea is sending. They are the ones likely to be serving the role of middlemen between the 2 countries' respective ground forces. But as you might have noticed, the number of troops on the move and the number of reported officers don't match the intelligence. And there's no mention of civilian or even military interpreters in any of the reports from South Korea or Ukraine about troop movements. That means that the Russian military might still be expecting more troops to come from North Korea, or that it needs to pull some of its own men from other units to act as senior officers or interpreters for the new forces. Either way, the lack of communication between Russian and North Korean soldiers on the ground means that they are unlikely to be as effective as they should be in the first place. Finally, North Korea doesn't typically allow its people to leave the country without an incentive to keep them chained to the motherland. For diplomats, this usually means that one member of the family will be left in North Korea as an unofficial hostage. For the soldiers who are traveling to Russia, the preventative measures are likely to be even harsher. A report from the Center for International and Strategic Studies suggests that the soldiers are likely to be cherry-picked to be the most loyal to the country, or have significant ties that would make misconduct, that is, desertion, potentially devastating. The report indicates that the troops could be accompanied by officials from the Workers' Party of Korea, the ruling body of the North Korean government. The officials would have the authority to follow the troops' every move, documenting their appearance, behavior, combat preparedness, and even more importantly, whether they plan to take items or knowledge back home. The last item on the list is one that's been particularly important for North Korea. Keeping outside knowledge away from the citizens is just one of the ways that the country has maintained a stranglehold on the population, and new interactions between North Koreans and Russians might have exactly the opposite effect. To counter that, the Center for International and Strategic Studies suggests that the soldiers might be sent to re-indoctrination camps to reaffirm their loyalty to the country before they return to North Korea. But what about the men themselves? How likely is it they're actually willing to go to Russia to fight for another army? There are a few different avenues to answering these questions. As mentioned, there's a high possibility that the soldiers sent to Russia are going to be among the most loyal and capable, making them relatively safe bets to stick around in the army and then return back home, if they don't die in the process, which is more likely. For these troops, going to Russia presents a unique opportunity to get out of North Korea to gain prestige and higher social standing, including better job opportunities back home. Even the families of people who died in the war in Russia might get significant benefits, social respect, and advantages. Additionally, working outside of the country will give these people an opportunity to earn significantly more than they could at home. Based on interviews with previous defectors, the average soldier earns less than $1 per day. Yep, that's right, a single dollar. The deal with Russia, where the country will pay a regular Russian soldier's salary to North Korea, stipulates that only 10 to 15% of that will be given to the soldier. Even then, a year on the battlefield will net a soldier somewhere between $1,500 and $2,500, which is practically a fortune in North Korea. This could result in many more young men volunteering to serve in Russia, despite more than likely being constantly under surveillance by North Korean authorities. The chance to experience another country and earn significantly more money than back home is practically a siren's call. Of course, there's also the matter of the inherent danger that comes with serving alongside the Russian military. Initial reports from the Ukrainian military have suggested that some North Koreans are already seeing combat operations in Kursk and even possibly outside the region. The combination of foreign terrain, language barriers, and subpar experience and training seems to be affecting the new North Korean soldiers, as the Ukrainians say they were less than impressed after seeing their performance. Reports state that Russia has put the North Korean men in Russian uniforms to make them less discernible from native Russians. Engagements with these soldiers have been on a small scale so far in Kursk, with military intelligence suggesting that this is a way to test the Ukrainian defenses set up in the region and the actual combat potential of the new troops. While the casualties among North Korean soldiers are yet to be precisely calculated, reports from the Ukrainian military confirm that several North Korean men have already died while fighting for Russia, and more are likely to die if the alliance between Russia and North Korea continues. This brings about the second type of soldier that might have come from Korea, the planned defector. According to reports from Suspilna, a Ukrainian broadcasting company, at least 18 North Korean men have deserted their posts in Kursk. This might be a direct result of the soldiers being faced with the harsh reality of fighting in a modern war. Of course, it could be a completely unrelated event, where the soldiers use the redeployment itself as an opportunity to defect from the country. Previously, most defections from North Korea were done over the China and Russia borders, as the DMZ between North and South Korea is practically impossible to cross. However, both China and Russia have laws in place that call for the return of any captured defectors to North Korea. Still, defectors take their chances by crossing over the northern border of North Korea. From there, they enter countries like Mongolia to the north of China, or Thailand, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia to the south of China. But the ultimate finish line for North Korean defectors is much closer to home: South Korea. This is exactly why they tried to get into the territory of some of the aforementioned Chinese neighbors. Unlike China, these countries are friendlier to North Korean defectors. Rather than deporting them back to North Korea, they are moved to South Korea instead. This is how most of the former soldiers who have asked to join Ukraine's military actually defected from North Korea, and likely the most common way to do so. However, the war in Ukraine presented a somewhat unique opportunity. As we stated, the troops that North Korea has sent to Russia are likely to be extremely loyal to the country. Add to that the fact that the North Korean officials could be following their every move or even holding their families hostage to prevent escape attempts, and it's uncertain just how many soldiers would consider attempting to defect from Kursk. If they do, there's really no precedent for North Koreans crossing the Russian border over into any of its neighboring countries. Given how Russia's neighbors to the west are either NATO members, Belarus, or Ukraine, and that the Kursk region is only close to the Ukrainian border, it would likely be up to the Ukrainian authorities to determine what to do with any successful defectors. There's also the matter of Ukraine still holding a sizable chunk of occupied territory in the Kursk region. Even if Russia has received more trained soldiers in the form of North Koreans replacing Russian conscripts, there's ambiguity over whether this will greatly help Russia mount a successful counteroffensive in the border region. According to a BBC report from November 11th, The Ukrainian Defense Ministry estimates that Russia has deployed roughly 50,000 troops to the Kursk region to try and retake control of it. Out of these troops, at least 10,000 could be the aforementioned North Koreans. The actual count of North Korean soldiers being actively deployed in Kursk is uncertain. As we mentioned earlier, Ukraine has frequently reported that Russia is outfitting these North Koreans in Russian military garb, making them virtually indistinguishable from Russian soldiers from afar. Regardless, having thousands of North Korean soldiers engaging in battle with Ukrainian troops is likely going to end in Ukraine's favor. This is due to the Ukrainian military already having more than a few years of actual combat experience and creating detailed modes of modern warfare, including drone operations, which North Korea is unlikely to be prepared for. The clashes could result in squads of North Korean soldiers getting wiped out daily. Based on the numbers posted by the Ukrainian Defense Ministry, Russia is estimated to be losing more than 1,200 soldiers every day. Even if only a fraction of these losses are in the Kursk region, North Korean troop numbers could dwindle to practically nothing over the next few months. In a worst-case scenario, they could be gone within a few weeks. And this is where older North Korean defectors going to Ukraine plan to make a difference. By aligning themselves with the Ukrainian military as volunteers, they could potentially join either the troops stationed at Kursk or the ones on the front lines in the Donbass region. While most of the 200 ex-military men are unlikely to be fit for service anymore, they could use their experience of serving in the North Korean army in other ways. A North Korean spokesperson from the group mentioned that their mere presence in Ukraine would be a psychological weapon that could be used against fellow North Koreans in Russia. They could be examples of the benefits North Korean soldiers who dare defect and cross over to the Ukrainian side could see. The volunteers could act as interpreters and broadcast messages that specifically target the North Korean members of the Russian military. This would create a double loss for Russia, in a way. If the North Korean defectors working for Ukraine manage to persuade their compatriots stationed in Kursk to leave the Russian military altogether, it could put a dent in Russia's plans to retake the region with foreign forces. But more importantly, it would show Russians that North Korean soldiers might not be as reliable to them as it would first seem. This could potentially damage the relationship between Russia and North Korea, which might have devastating consequences for both nations. The planned mutual defense agreement between the countries hinges on the fact that North Korea can provide something of value to Russia. Before the North Korean troops were deployed to Kursk, this value came in the form of regular artillery ammunition shipments. In response, Russia is suspected to have sent vital food supplies to North Korea. For the soldiers themselves, Russia is likely paying much more, considering that there are reports that it's paying North Korea over $200 million a year for the 10,000 soldiers and sending up to 700,000 metric tons of rice. If those soldiers ended up not fighting for Russia at all, then Russia would have effectively wasted the money and effort of conscripting and transporting them from North Korea to Kursk. Even worse for Putin, North Korean soldiers defecting directly to Ukraine might make them eligible to serve in the Ukrainian International Legion, although it's unlikely, effectively giving the Ukrainian military more manpower, all on Russia's dime. The monetary loss that Russia would need to swallow could sour the agreement between the two countries. If a precedent is set showing that North Korean troops aren't reliable and loyal to Russia, then Russia doesn't have any guarantees that the next batch of soldiers won't behave the same. As a result, its investments in North Korea might find themselves being rerouted elsewhere. This is warranted by Russia's economy practically working overtime to fund the war, as the country has lost trade connections with most of the world after the invasion. Its other major partners are in Central Asia and the Middle East, with the latter having their own problems in the current Israel-Hamas-Hezbollah conflict. But the more important aspect of North Koreans defecting from Russia would be the devastating reputation loss that both countries would suffer. North Korea has been making waves in global geopolitics, particularly due to its rising ballistic missile technology level and extreme militarization capacity. But the country has been practically shielded by alliances with Russia and China. If the Kremlin sees that its investment in North Korea is not bearing much fruit, even though North Korea is fulfilling its end of the mutual defense agreement, then one part of that alliance might be over. The situation with China isn't much better. China has been a relatively silent ally of Russia for the past 30 months or so. It's helped Russia mitigate Western sanctions and most likely smuggled vital technology into Russia so it could continue to manufacture modern weapon systems. However, on the public scene, China hasn't officially condemned nor provided support for Russia's plans. The one time China made a definitive show of support to Russia was proposing a bold peace or ceasefire agreement, in which Russia would get to keep the territory it occupied in Donbass, something that Ukraine would likely never settle for. China knows that its alliance with Russia is on thin ice. With over 30 months of warfare, Russia is slowly losing the ability to funnel its natural resources into China, a trade deal on which the entire China-Russian relations actually hinge, rather than some geopolitical camaraderie. And if the war in Russia continues to rage, countries that have been cooperative with China might start looking toward NATO or its allies. This could lead to China losing valuable trade agreements in the long run. The presence of North Korean troops in Russia further complicates matters. As long as these troops stay in Kursk, Putin is technically justified in calling for a mutual defense agreement between Russia and North Korea. However, if the Russian military makes a misstep and deploys North Korean soldiers on the front lines in Donbass, it would translate to nothing short of North Korea also declaring an aggressive war on Ukraine. This could possibly set NATO on a path to do the same, directly sending its own military to Ukraine in response, or ramping up its military equipment donations to the country. If Russia doesn't play this carefully, it could inadvertently drag both North Korea and China into war not only with Ukraine, but with NATO and its various allies. China most likely isn't ready for this, especially with Russia already weakened by fighting a prolonged war. As a result, China itself could also be rethinking its alliance with North Korea. If North Korea does end up losing support from both Russia and China as a result of directly taking part in the war in Ukraine, there's no telling what might happen. As mentioned, North Korea and South Korea are still technically embroiled in the Korean War. While South Korea hasn't made any offensive moves yet, and its military has been purely defense-orientated so far, shows of blatant aggression by North Korea are unlikely to go unnoticed. And North Korea sending over 10,000 soldiers to a country halfway across the world can be seen as nothing but aggressive. The North Korean military has also recently bombed two major roads that used to connect the northern and southern parts of the Korean peninsula, further trying to separate itself from South Korea by declaring it a hostile state. The South Korean military is considered to be decades ahead of its North Korean counterpart, at least in terms of conventional warfare. The military is frequently ranked among the top 10 most powerful in the world. This high ranking is partially due to ongoing alliances with the US, which has allowed the country to modernize its domestic defense industry in recent decades. Thus, South Korea has become the world's 9th largest weapons exporter. The bulk of the country's military development efforts are put into creating an insurmountable defensive force, spurred by the fact that Pyongyang and Seoul are just 120 miles away from one another. South Korea's military has fewer active personnel, but probably more reservists, since it has a similar mandatory military service requirement to North Korea, albeit with shorter service durations. This means a potential renewal of the Korean War would see the South Korean military outnumbered, but still maintain a clear technological advantage in conventional warfare. Of course, there are worries that North Korea has been developing nuclear weapons, especially considering its proclivity to conduct missile tests by the dozens each year. South Korea currently doesn't have nuclear weapons on its own, relying on the US nuclear deterrence systems for protection. However, the recent shifts in the US foreign policy, which are likely going to move away from South Korea with President-elect Donald Trump being reinstalled in January, could mean that South Korea might start planning to develop its own nuclear weapons. This would mean that China would see yet another nuclear country in its vicinity, further discouraging it from supporting North Korea openly. All these factors combined make North Koreans being stationed in Russia a dangerous prospect. First, the soldiers could very well be killed without making a significant impact in either Kursk or the regions closer to the front in Donbass. Essentially, they'd be sent to their deaths for no good reason. Secondly, the alliance between Russia and North Korea might become strained if the latter's military proves to be of little use to Russia. This could lead to dangerous precedents, where South Korea becomes emboldened in the use of its military or further ramps up its defensive arsenals in anticipation of a renewed conflict on the Korean peninsula. Third, China's situation grows more precarious, with every one of its allies making waves in global geopolitics, but the country itself is not yet powerful enough to exert influence and military power that could rival the US. And fourth, North Korea sending troops to Russia could mean NATO can justify being more aggressive in assisting Ukraine, which could cut short Russia's attempts to gain more ground in Donbass rather quickly. Throughout all that, it's essentially up to Ukraine whether it accepts the North Korean defector volunteers from South Korea. If those new additions can make a difference in Kursk by directly making North Korean soldiers defect from Russia, it could lead to a series of events that inevitably turn the war in Ukraine's favor and damage Russia and China's reputation in global geopolitics. And they could also make a real difference by potentially saving thousands of lives. What do you think? How will the relationship between North Korea, Russia, and Ukraine progress in light of these events?
There is not a single reason for North Koreans to fight and die for Putin. That's what Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky wrote on X, formerly Twitter, on December 16, 2024. And yet North Koreans fighting for Russia and President Vladimir Putin seem to be dropping like flies in the Kursk Oblast. And there are many reasons for this, but not the kind Zelensky was referring to. No, these are far more tangible and far more disastrous. A lack of proper training leaves the North Korean troops unprepared. Their inexperience on the battlefield shows in every misstep, The language barrier only compounds the chaos, turning even basic commands into confusion. But above all, it's their catastrophically bad tactics, so flawed they practically guarantee failure, that are driving these staggering losses. So let's break down exactly what's going wrong on the ground, focusing on the tactics that are making the North Koreans nothing more than sitting ducks in a war they should have never been involved in. To understand just how dire the situation in Kursk is, we need to look at the shocking casualties first. Casualties that are turning the Russo-Ukrainian war into a death trap for the North Koreans. By December 16th, the first major reports began to surface regarding North Korean soldiers fighting and dying in Kursk. Zelensky confirmed that North Korean troops had been involved in combat operations in the region and the toll was already severe. This early confirmation marked the beginning of a brutal and deadly chapter for the North Koreans in Kursk. White House National Security Communications Advisor John Kirby further confirmed the North Korean casualties, stating that the North Korean soldiers had moved from secondary positions to the front lines in recent days. While no specific casualty numbers were initially provided, the severity of the situation became clear as reports continued to emerge from the front lines. By December 23rd, it was confirmed that over 3,000 North Korean troops had either been killed or wounded in the Kursk Oblast. That's a quarter of the total 12,000 North Korean soldiers deployed to the region. The reports coming from South Korea were a little more conservative, but disastrous nonetheless. The South Korean Joint Chiefs of Staff stated that at least 1,100 North Korean soldiers had been killed or wounded by that point. Though the figures differ, both sources agreed on one thing: the casualties are mounting at an alarming rate, and there's no clear end in sight. The confirmation of this came only a few days later, on December 27th, when Kirby stated that the North Korean forces suffered roughly 1,000 casualties in a single week. And yet North Korea is showing no signs of backing down. In fact, reports suggest that Kim Jong-un, the country's supreme leader, is planning to send more troops to Russia. This shocking fact begs the question, why? Why would Kim, in the face of overwhelming losses, continue to send more troops, knowing full well the fate that awaits them? The answer is simple: greed. Because who cares about human lives when there's so much to gain? Every dead North Korean soldier is a small price to pay for the rewards Kim is reaping from Russia's President Vladimir Putin. First, there's oil. Since March 2024, Russia has supplied North Korea with over 1 million barrels of oil, double the annual cap imposed by international sanctions. Then there's the military technology. Russia's more than happy to throw some goodies to sweeten the deal. In exchange for troops and weapons, North Korea is receiving air defense systems and the know-how to launch its spy satellites. What's more, satellite imagery shows that North Korea is expanding its missile production facilities, specifically making advancements on its KN-23 and KN-24 ballistic missiles. But it doesn't stop there. North Korea has also been promised fighter jets like MiG-29s and Su-27s. That's right, Russia handing over advanced aircraft that will vastly improve North Korea's air capabilities. Of course, North Korea is also improving Russia's military capabilities, supplying the country with a steady stream of artillery and mortar shells. Believe it or not, as much as 60% of Russia's munitions are currently coming from North Korea. Even more shockingly, North Korea is now sending newer, more advanced weapons, like the 240mm multiple-launch rocket systems equipped with cutting-edge guidance systems. But all of this comes at a price. According to experts, Russia could be paying up to $572 million every year just to keep North Korean troops on the front lines. As for the weapons, they could have earned Kim up to $5.5 billion since the start of the invasion. That's quite a hefty sum for any country, let alone a regime as cash-strapped as North Korea. So what if Kim's troops are slaughtered in Kursk? He's getting a deal that's more than worth it: cash, oil, and weapons that keep his regime stable and strong. So to him, it's business as usual. Of course, if even a fraction of the millions Kim is raking in was spent on properly training and equipping his troops for the realities of modern warfare, their fate in Russia wouldn't be so disastrous. With the right preparation, they wouldn't be cannon fodder, blindly marching to their deaths. But that's exactly what North Korean troops are in Russia, and their outdated tactics are mostly to blame. The tactic that cost North Koreans and Russians the most is undoubtedly the so-called meat grinder tactic. This tactic served the North Korean troops poorly in the Korean War, and it's serving them even worse now in Russia. The tactic relies on sheer numbers of infantry advancing in waves, hoping to break through Ukrainian defenses simply by overwhelming them. But the tragic reality of this strategy is that it wastes lives and achieves little more than carnage. After all, this approach is painfully obsolete in the face of modern warfare. It essentially has North Korean troops running through open fields in massive groups without armored support, And those open fields, they are ripe for Ukrainian drones and artillery. So this tactic makes North Korean troops nothing more than targets easily mowed down by precision strikes. Oftentimes, they can't even get close to their target, let alone breach the defenses. This outright stupid tactic has been deployed by the North Koreans throughout their December attacks. In mid-December, these troops participated in an assault near Kruglenko, a village in the Kursk Oblast. This assault was part of a joint Russian offensive to capture key positions in the region. The plan was to secure the forests that would allow further advancements toward Malaya Loknaya, a village captured by Ukrainian forces as part of their Kursk incursion. However, as history has repeatedly shown, the meat grinder tactic had disastrous consequences. The initial assault, comprised mostly of North Korean infantry, ended in failure, as the troops were devastated by Ukrainian drones and artillery. Though they managed to establish a foothold in the forest, the toll was staggering, which begs the question, was the slight territorial gain worth the bloodshed? In the aftermath of these heavy losses, Russian commanders attempted to shift the focus of the assault, directing the North Koreans to another area of the Kursk salient. But once again, the same ineffective tactics played out. Even with the change in direction, North Korean forces were sent into the same open fields, with their infantry once again picked apart by Ukrainian artillery and drones. So despite some moments of territorial gain, these assaults ended in slaughter as well, with North Korean forces once again failing to achieve any lasting strategic success. Of course, this approach is by no means new to the Russian forces. Putin has long relied on sending troops in open fields without support, accepting heavy losses to achieve minor, temporary advantages. It just seems that now he has found new cannon fodder, the North Koreans. With their historical experience of mass infantry assaults, they fit right into this horrific approach. However, the consequences of the meat grinder tactic were only made worse by another useless tactic, or better yet, a lack of a tactic. You see, the North Koreans have been failing to properly hide themselves during their advances. While attempting to build up forces in wooded areas and launch concentrated counterattacks, they neglected the basic principles of camouflage and concealment. Although truthfully, they might not be familiar with these principles in the first place. That's how poor their training and combat experience is. The Ukrainian forces have already witnessed just how poorly prepared the North Koreans are for modern combat based on their reaction to drones. Instead of freezing or taking cover, as more experienced Russians have been trained to do, North Korean soldiers tend to panic and run when they see or hear a drone approaching. This reaction directly exposes them to further attack, making them easy targets for precision strikes. Their instinct to flee when faced with the presence of a drone betrays a lack of discipline and proper training, which could have otherwise taught them the value of remaining still. Without proper concealment tactics, the North Korean troops were left exposed to devastating Ukrainian strikes, transforming their massed forces into easy targets. Ukrainians have even used HIMARS cluster munitions to take the North Koreans out as they were approaching. The narrow terrain didn't exactly help either, leaving the North Korean troops bunched up and helpless in the face of the onslaught. But this is exactly what the Ukrainian forces wanted. You see, these forces actually have smart tactics, unlike their enemies in the Russo-Ukrainian war. In one instance, the Ukrainian troops withdrew from their positions in the forest, creating a vacuum that the advancing North Koreans inevitably filled. But as soon as they moved in, the Ukrainian forces used drones to relay their coordinates for HIMARS rocket systems, which unleashed cluster munitions on the tightly packed North Korean assault units. The result was devastating. The valley quickly became a kill zone, and the North Korean advance was decisively crushed. The failure to properly conceal their positions and plan for modern combat scenarios led to not only a failed assault, but also unnecessary deaths. The lack of tactical discipline, paired with poor decision-making, left the North Korean troops vulnerable in a way that could have been avoided with basic military strategy. Seeing that Ukrainian precision attacks were taking out swarms of soldiers, the North Koreans attempted another foolish tactic. They started using their own soldiers as human bait. That's right, they send their soldiers directly to their deaths in an effort to distract Ukrainian drone operators. Usually, a single soldier would serve as the live bait. At the same time, other soldiers in the unit were waiting for Ukrainian drones to target the bait to shoot them down. Unsurprisingly, this tactic led to another catastrophic result. Simply put, the Ukrainian drone operators didn't fall for this tactic. Not only that, but they also quickly identified the concentrated positions of the North Korean troops waiting nearby. They were then targeted by precision strikes, and the survivors, well, they were hunted down by more drones, bringing a swift and brutal end to their misguided tactics. Ultimately, the human bait tactic proved to be nothing more than a costly exercise in futility. The North Korean attempts to sacrifice soldiers to distract drones only led to massive casualties and failed assaults. And as if that wasn't enough, North Korean troops also showed a complete disregard for their wounded. Even worse, this doesn't appear to be a result of poor planning or simple oversight. It's rather a deeply ingrained tactical mindset rooted in outdated military practices. Reports from Ukrainian soldiers on the ground have consistently highlighted this disturbing behavior. One harrowing report detailed a first-person view or FPV drone strike that hit a group of 3 North Korean soldiers, knocking 2 down. Despite clear signs of life, the third soldier showed no urgency to assist or call for help. Instead, he stood still for a moment, observing the fallen, before moving forward as if the casualties were nothing more than a minor setback. In another instance, shells exploded just a few feet away from North Korean soldiers, yet they continued to move forward without reacting or acknowledging the danger they had just faced. This chilling indifference to the well-being of their comrades, and even themselves, highlights not only the brutality of their tactics, but also the deep disregard for human life that seems to pervade the North Korean military culture. But then again, they aren't alone in this. The North Korean approach reflects similar strategies employed by Russian forces, who have also been criticized for their lack of care for the injured. This approach allowed North Korean troops to make some significant advances in Kursk. Even as North Korean assault groups suffered heavy casualties, they continued to push forward under massive fire support from Russian units and the influence of electronic warfare against Ukrainian drones. Despite being hit by precision strikes and shelling, the North Korean infantry remained relentless, yet completely ignorant of the heavy losses they were sustaining. According to Ukrainian military blogger Yuri Butasov, no evacuation of the wounded or dead was carried out during these assaults, adding further to the inhumane nature of their strategy. Given these circumstances, it isn't surprising that footage from the battlefield often shows piles of North Korean bodies lying just where they fell, abandoned by their comrades. It's one thing for the regime to treat its soldiers as expendable, but it's another when your own comrades fail to even attempt to aid you, leaving you to die alone on the battlefield. This brutal disregard for the wounded reflects a breakdown not only in the North Korean military strategy, but in the very sense of camaraderie and brotherhood that typically holds a fighting force together. This tactic, as well as all other tactics employed by North Koreans in Kursk, ultimately failed to deliver the desired results. The only thing they did manage to achieve was to leave a trail of death and suffering in their wake. However, as mentioned at the beginning of the video, the high death toll can't be entirely blamed on poor North Korean military tactics, not when essentially everything is working against these troops in Russia. The first glaring issue here is the rudimentary training the North Korean soldiers received before being thrown into the fray. With time and resources in short supply, these troops were given only the barest understanding of modern warfare. And who was in charge of training them, you ask? The Russian airborne forces and marine brigades, units that had themselves been battered by months of heavy losses and numerous failed assaults. To make matters worse, many of their seasoned instructions were either dead or incapacitated, leaving the North Koreans to learn under the guidance of troops who had already been through hell themselves. So it's no surprise that these recruits were hopelessly unprepared for the complexities of contemporary warfare. For those curious about the specifics, the 810th Naval Infantry Brigade was reportedly involved in training the North Korean soldiers in the Kursk Oblast. This brigade doesn't exactly have the best reputation, and that's putting it lightly. In 2023, it was embroiled in scandal after it was revealed that its personnel were deliberately using chemical weapons in Ukraine, a blatant violation of international law. So they aren't exactly the dream instructors for soldiers in need of quality training, are they? But this lack of proper training wasn't just theoretical. We saw it on the battlefield, when North Korean soldiers became exhausted from walking across open fields and, under fire, sat down to rest. Yeah, you heard that right. It's not like they have anything to fear in an open field during a war, but alas, no one had taught them to expect the kind of ferocious attrition they'd face in modern combat. Then there's the language barrier issue, which created further chaos in North Korean coordination with Russian forces. Reports from the front lines suggest that communication was almost non-existent between the two groups. In some cases, even friendly fire incidents occurred, including a disastrous moment where North Korean forces fired on Russian ATTRIBUTION Battalion vehicles, leading to the deaths of 8 Chechen soldiers. Though this was a tragic misstep, it wasn't entirely unexpected. After all, you've got two forces trying to work together who are unable to understand one another. That's a disaster just waiting to happen. And let's not forget the winter conditions, which exacerbate every single issue. When the terrain is covered in snow and ice, movement becomes a struggle. But for the North Koreans, it wasn't just the weather that was a challenge. It was their complete lack of equipment and preparation. They weren't ready for the bitter cold, and it made their positions even more conspicuous to Ukrainian forces, who had no trouble picking them off one by one. In the end, it's clear. When you combine inferior tactics, poor training, a lack of equipment, and disastrous coordination, you end up with high casualties. And the North Koreans learned this lesson the hard way. A tragedy, yes, but a predictable one. But where are the Russians in all of this? What are they doing about these disastrous North Korean losses? If you were to ask Putin this question, you would probably get a question back. What North Koreans? Yeah, the Russians are going to great lengths to hide the fact that North Korean forces are even in Russia. And let us tell you, they're pulling out all the stops. Zelensky even revealed that Russian forces have been burning the faces of fallen North Korean soldiers to cover up their identities. It's a cloak and dagger operation, with the dagger being put into the North Koreans' backs. The Kremlin is also making sure that no North Korean faces are visible while training on Russian soil. And when this fails, they reportedly attempt to destroy video footage showing North Korean soldiers in action. If you can't hide the troops, hide the evidence, right? What's more, even Putin himself seems so deeply embarrassed by the whole situation. Despite his open relations with North Korea, the Russian president made a point of not mentioning North Korean troops during his annual Direct Line press conference in December, and this press conference lasted for 4.5 hours. The question remains, is Putin embarrassed by using foreign troops in general, or is it specifically the incompetent North Koreans that are causing him discomfort? Feel free to share your answer to this question in the comments section below. And while you're doing that, think about this. Are the absurd tactics employed by the brainwashed North Korean troops the true cause of their catastrophic losses? And how much longer can this madness continue? In June 2024, two nations inked a deal that made the world shudder. Dubbed the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership, this wasn't just another pact barely worth the paper it was printed on. It was a declaration of defiance against the US and its allies, wrapped in grandiose promises of a just and multipolar new world order. Sounds noble, right? Not when you know the players involved: Russia and North Korea. On one side, you've got Russia, a pariah state stumbling under the weight of its disastrous Ukraine war. On the other, North Korea, a nuclear-armed hermit kingdom ruled by a man with policies as striking as his haircut. But somehow, in this cruel, chaotic world, Russian President Vladimir Putin and Supreme Leader Kim Jong-un found each other. A match made in authoritarian heaven. Before the pact between the world's most volatile dictatorship and the world's most belligerent wannabe superpower was even ratified, North Korea sent over 10,000 troops to Russia, a move NATO immediately branded as a dangerous escalation. But little did NATO, and even Putin, know that there was absolutely nothing dangerous about these troops. Think less battle-hardened warriors and more poorly rehearsed extras in a military parade. It immediately became clear that Kim didn't send his best. He sent his leftovers, and Putin, he fell for it. Let's break down this massive joke played on Putin and its implications for the war in Ukraine. To understand just how this farce unfolded, we need to look at these North Korean troops in more detail, where they are, what they're doing, and why Putin thought they were the answer to his problems. Though different figures have been thrown around for weeks, the latest estimates put the total number of North Korean soldiers in Russia at around 11,000. According to Ukraine's Defense Intelligence (GUR), about 2,000 of them have joined Russian units, while the remaining 9,000 act as a reserve force in what appears to be a strategy to fill secondary positions. These roles include guarding checkpoints, digging fortifications, and holding observation posts, tasks that free up Russian soldiers for frontline combat. However, some reports suggest that this could just be the beginning. Ukrainian intelligence speculates Pyongyang could send up to 100,000 troops in the future. Now, this would undoubtedly be an unsettling prospect if it weren't for how utterly useless these troops have proven to be. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. These North Korean troops reportedly started arriving in Russia in October, then traveled another 4,000 miles from Vladivostok to Kursk. The Kursk region is also where most of these troops have taken up positions, working alongside Russian units like the 22nd Motorized Rifle Regiment and the 11th Separate Air Assault Brigade. Reports suggest that Russia has amassed a combined force of 50,000 soldiers, including the North Koreans, with a single goal: retake the territory seized by Ukraine during its summer offensive. The North Korean element aligns with Putin's attempts to solve Russia's ongoing manpower crisis, without triggering a politically risky mass mobilization. With casualty estimates nearing 762,000 and recruitment struggling to keep pace, Putin simply needs every extra soldier he can find. But you know what they say, be careful what you wish for. Sometimes having no soldiers might be better than inheriting an army so inept that it's practically a liability, and Putin is learning this lesson as we speak. You see, the soldiers sent to Russia are nothing but North Korea's rejects. Clumsy, unfit, and completely unqualified. They're less of an army and more of a collection of military misfits. But this shouldn't be surprising to anyone familiar with the North Korean military. Sure, North Korea might have 1.3 million active duty personnel, making it one of the largest armies in the world. However, that's all Kim cares about: quantity. It's certainly not quality. The entire structure of the North Korean military is designed around brute manpower, not modern warfare.
training is minimal and outdated, so much so that some of the North Korean soldiers sent to Russia couldn't even hold a rifle without dropping it. Of course, there's nothing shocking about this, given that their training is also limited by severe shortages. Fuel, ammunition, and modern equipment are all in critically short supply. Defectors from North Korea often reveal that many soldiers spend more time farming potatoes than firing weapons, as they are regularly diverted to boost the struggling civilian economy. Even the special operations units, the so-called elite, don't fare much better. Their equipment is often unavailable due to supply chain breakdowns caused by international sanctions and internal mismanagement. The absurdity of deploying such troops was laid bare in intercepted Russian communications, where one frustrated soldier exclaimed, "What do we do with them?" This sentiment, augmented by an expletive or two, speaks volumes about the combat readiness of the North Korean troops. But let's be honest, North Korean soldiers still have it worse than their Russian counterparts. After all, they're practically skeletons, walking embodiments of the country's chronic food crisis. So it's no wonder the North Koreans in Russia can't complete some basic physical tasks like jogging just 65 feet. Of course, this is no anomaly among a population accustomed to malnourishment, but the soldiers truly have it rough. A perverse belief that hunger makes for tougher soldiers ensures that even military rations are meager. Their diet typically consists of barely edible scraps, boiled roots, a handful of corn, or on lucky days, small portions of rice scavenged from the countryside. Food desperation has historically driven North Korean soldiers to criminal acts, raiding civilian homes, food storage depots, and even military kitchens to steal anything edible. In one horrifying incident, 2 starving soldiers stabbed a civilian mother and daughter to death while stealing food from a kindergarten. It's desperation pushing soldiers to acts of barbarity. Even their leaders fare poorly. One source described high-ranking officers deployed to border construction projects who were so emaciated that they looked on the verge of collapse. Their gaunt appearance speaks to the near impossibility of maintaining discipline or cohesion among troops who can barely stand, let alone fight. That's probably the case with the 3 North Korean generals reportedly sent to command the troops in Russia. Now, you might think, wouldn't these horrifying conditions in their homeland make Russia look almost like a haven to them? Well, the answer might have been yes, if the North Korean troops weren't also being starved in Russia. Despite initial reports that Moscow was treating the first batch of North Korean soldiers well to attract more, those hopes faded quickly. In fact, the only thing overflowing among the troops stationed in Kursk is tension. The North Korean soldiers who were promised better conditions have voiced their dissatisfaction with the inadequate food supplies. To address the growing unrest, Russian officials were forced to intervene. Major General Mevlutov, deputy commander for resource support of the Leningrad military district, was dispatched to oversee the situation. Upon arrival in Kursk, he ordered the emergency redistribution of rations from the Russian 11th Guards Air Assault Brigade. However, while the North Korean troops didn't find sufficient food in Russia, they did find another thing: an odd form of freedom. Deploying North Korean troops to Russia plunged them into a world they are ill-equipped to navigate. Coming from one of the most isolated nations on Earth, they have little concept of the outside world, let alone modern warfare. Tanks or farming tractors, it's all the same to them, underscoring just how ignorant they are about modern military equipment. But that's not the only thing they're ignorant about. North Korean defectors spoke of their astonishment at basic amenities like electricity, running water, and proper meals when encountering other countries. And even these are just the beginning. Reports suggest that some North Korean soldiers in Russia, exposed to the internet for the first time, have spent significant downtime consuming online pornography. Yep, Putin was promised disciplined soldiers, but instead received a culture-shocked contingent that can't fight, can't think, and is dangerously out of its depth. Kim has truly pulled off a masterstroke. He disposed of his unwanted soldiers while embarrassing his supposed ally. But let's be honest, Putin is also at fault here. He might have gotten played by Kim, but he walked right into it. After all, what did he expect? That foreign soldiers with no Russian knowledge and no real-world combat experience would magically become an effective fighting force overnight? From these 2 issues alone, Putin should have known that accepting North Korean soldiers was a bad idea. Now let's talk about combat experience and where things really fall apart. North Korean troops are essentially rookies in modern combat. Their deployment in Kursk actually represents the first major battle these soldiers have seen since the Korean War in the early 1950s. That's over 70 years ago. Now don't get us wrong, North Korean soldiers have been sent abroad before, but these were small-scale deployments. During the Vietnam War, they sent fewer than 100 pilots and a psychological warfare unit. In the Yom Kippur War, they deployed 1,500 military advisors and specialists. But their numbers weren't the issue, their roles were. They were only supporting others, not on the front lines in direct combat. That's why their experience in fighting large-scale wars is practically non-existent. The same can be said for other notable North Korean foreign deployments.
In the 1980s, North Korea sent just 25 military advisors to Libya, and in 1987, 50 advisors to Uganda. The most recent instance was in Syria, where North Korea sent 20 specialists, though some reports suggest it could have been more. Still, these units were far removed from the brutal realities of frontline warfare. So when Putin thought he was getting thousands of highly trained soldiers to help in the battle for Ukraine, what he got were soldiers who've been out of action for decades. But this isn't a case of bad intelligence, as the misguided invasion of Ukraine was. This was an absolute miscalculation on Putin's part. That's why he's now dealing with soldiers who have spent more time on parade than on the battlefield. And for any military operation, that's a problem you can't ignore. Another problem you can't ignore? A language barrier. This might sound trivial, but in a military setting it's a massive issue, especially when you're dealing with soldiers who already lack combat experience. Military coordination is complex and requires constant communication, precise orders, and real-time responses. So when you throw a language barrier into the mix, you get chaos, not a well-oiled machine. The North Korean soldiers in Russia are struggling to pick up Russian, with the language training reportedly limited to around 100 key military terms. That's just not enough when the stakes are this high. In a real battlefield scenario, even small misunderstandings can result in disaster. The Russians might have been able to teach them how to say attack, but without fluency, they're not going to know the tactical nuances. That's why even integrating these soldiers into Russian military units at lower levels is going to be like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. The Russians will have to rely on translators, which is hardly an ideal setup for real-time battle conditions where seconds count. So when Putin imagined North Korean soldiers seamlessly joining Russian forces, he might have overlooked one crucial detail. If these troops can't understand their commanders, they're not going to be able to execute orders properly, and their performance will be even worse than expected. Putin's humiliation grows when you realize what he actually got out of this desperate band-aid for Russia's recruitment problem: a direct hit on Russian territory. You see, Putin's decision to bring in North Korean troops has directly led to Ukraine getting the green light to launch long-range missile strikes on Russian soil. President Joe Biden was the first to authorize Kyiv to use American-supplied ATACMS to strike targets inside Russia, and British Storm Shadow and French Scalp missiles followed suit. These long-range weapons had been a sensitive issue for months, but once North Korean troops were deployed in Russia, Biden approved their use, specifically targeting Russian and North Korean forces in the Kursk region. For Putin, that means the battlefield has expanded some 186 miles into the Russian territory, and now Russia itself is under attack. The very soldiers Putin thought would help him win are now indirectly causing him to lose even more ground. What a turn of events. And Kim? Well, he's the real winner in this deal. First and foremost, he got rid of his worst soldiers, the ones who were more of a burden than a benefit to North Korea's military. Sending these troops to fight for Russia, where they're far from home and unlikely to ever return, was a perfect way to clean house. After all, we aren't talking about elite units, we're talking about expendable cannon fodder, easily sacrificed to the chaos of war. Then there's the financial gain. The Russian government reportedly pays North Korean soldiers $2,000 per month, and most of that money likely ends up in the state coffers, not with the soldiers themselves. For a nation like North Korea, which has long struggled with economic hardship and foreign currency shortages, this is a much-needed cash injection. Of course, there's also the nuclear advantage. Kim has already started leveraging the alliance with Russia to enhance North Korea's nuclear ambitions. In this regard, the Russia-North Korea pact could end up being a game-changer. Moscow's help could pave the way for Kim to enhance his nuclear weapons program and bolster the country's standing on the world stage. And if that wasn't enough, there's the military technology exchange. Russia has reportedly promised to provide North Korea with MiG-29 and Su-27 fighter jets, though these are older models. While they're not the top of the line, these jets still represent a significant boost to North Korea's air power, which could prove vital in the tense airspace above the Korean peninsula. Finally, we have strategic positioning. By aligning with Russia and increasing his military capabilities, Kim is further cementing his position in the so-called New Cold War. The geopolitical dynamics are shifting, and Pyongyang is capitalizing on the rising tensions between the US, China, and Russia. Now a new powerful triad is emerging, with China, Russia, and North Korea at its core. This triad would position Kim's regime as a significantly more influential player on the global stage. Essentially, Kim got everything he needed: the money, the military support, and the strategic leverage. And Putin paid the price. Now this raises a question. Why would Putin continue putting up with this crooked alliance? It's simple, really. He has no other choice. Behind closed doors, he can get furious. He can even threaten to send North Korean soldiers back, but publicly, he must maintain the illusion of strength in this alliance. Kim has already mastered this illusion. On November 30th, 2024, Kim publicly pledged North Korea's unwavering support for Russia's war in Ukraine, stressing that his country would back Russia's efforts
efforts to defend its sovereignty and territorial integrity. This strong declaration, made during a meeting with Russia's defense minister Andrei Belousov, was carefully crafted to help Kim maintain credibility with both Russia and his domestic audience, while publicly upholding the facade of his regime's strength. Putin too needs to act strong, despite the nasty surprise he's received. The deployment of North Korean troops is part of the ongoing narrative that Russia isn't isolated, but actively building alliances with countries like North Korea, which can project a united front in the face of Western sanctions and pressures. Ultimately, neither side will fess up to the real motivations behind their actions, because doing so would undermine their image of strength, something both leaders must maintain to avoid losing influence on the global stage. But knowing Putin, this humiliation won't go unpunished. He might not be able to hit back at Kim, but his troops, they're as good as dead. Russia is almost certainly going to use the North Korean troops as cannon fodder, a strategy designed to absorb massive losses while trying to overwhelm Ukrainian defenses through sheer numbers and brute force. This approach is a hallmark of the meat grinder tactics that Russia has relied on in various conflicts. By deploying thousands of poorly trained North Korean soldiers into the front lines, Russia can launch massive, wave-like assaults intended to overwhelm Ukrainian positions, even if it means sacrificing those soldiers in the process. Though don't expect Kim to care much about the deaths of his soldiers. His regime has consistently viewed its soldiers as expendable, so even sending them to die in Russia's war is just another sacrifice in Kim's pursuit of military and political gains. And North Korean troops have indeed started dying in Russia. On December 1st, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky mentioned in an interview with Kyodo News, a Japanese news agency, that some of the North Korean soldiers had already been killed in combat. The earliest reports indicating clashes involving North Korean troops came out in early November. According to the New York Times, the first engagement took place on November 5th, when North Korean troops, alongside Russia's 810th Separate Guards Order of Zhukov Naval Infantry Brigade, fought Ukrainian forces in the contested Kursk region. Although the skirmish was described as a limited engagement, likely intended as a probing attack to test Ukrainian defenses, it ended with a significant number of North Korean casualties, according to US and Ukrainian officials. Despite the absence of specific casualty figures, both officials, who spoke anonymously due to the sensitivity of the situation, confirmed that many North Korean soldiers were killed in this encounter. While the details remain scarce, including the number of fatalities, these deaths mark the beginning of what's likely to be a much larger toll on the North Korean forces. So who's really coming out on top here? Is Putin benefiting from this arrangement in any way, or has it only sealed his fate? And what about Kim? Will he truly get away with fooling Putin?
Putin's plan is falling apart again. The Russian president's decision to welcome up to 12,000 North Korean soldiers into Russia was meant to be a show of strength. For the first time in this war, foreign troops, beyond mercenaries, are officially part of the conflict. Putin wanted the world to believe this move symbolized his alliances and bolstered his position, but instead of reinforcing Russia's fight, it's become a colossal failure. The North Koreans have been thrown into a brutal battle for Kursk, where Russia lost 450 square miles of territory and over 90 settlements to Ukraine's surprise counteroffensive in August 2024. Now, Ukraine is refusing to give an inch, and the results are humiliating for Putin. In just 48 hours, Ukrainian forces wiped out an entire battalion of North Korean troops, dealing a devastating blow to Russia's counteroffensive. And here's the kicker, these were supposedly elite soldiers. So what went wrong for Putin? And what does this all mean for North Korea's future involvement in Russia's faltering war? We start with the news. During his January 4th nightly address to his nation, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky reported that brave Ukrainian fighters in Kursk had wiped out an entire battalion of North Korean soldiers. For context, a battalion is typically made up of between 500 and 1,000 soldiers, though the numbers can vary. Some battalions may only contain a few hundred soldiers, with others meeting the full quotient of 1,000. Regardless, destroying an entire battalion means Ukraine has just eradicated a substantial portion of the troops North Korea sent to Russia to support Putin's efforts to retake Kursk. Worst of all for North Korea, it experienced these massive losses in just 2 days of fighting. The commander-in-chief also reported on the situation in the Kursk region, Zelensky told his listeners during his daily address. Specifically, in battles today and yesterday near just one village, Makhnovka in the Kursk region, the Russian army lost up to a battalion of infantry, including North Korean soldiers and Russian paratroopers. And that's tangible, Zelensky concluded. The news will be a massive morale booster for a Ukraine which is struggling to hold on to Kursk. Reports suggest that Russia has managed to reclaim about 40% of the territory Ukraine took in the oblast since it launched its counteroffensive toward the end of 2024. That's on top of Russia controlling about a fifth of Ukraine's territory and making slight gains as a result of its push in the Donetsk region. You'll also notice that Zelensky mentioned North Korean soldiers and Russian paratroopers in his address. That tells us that Russia is mixing and matching within its battalions, trying to mingle North Korean soldiers with Russians in its assaults on Ukraine's defensive positions. A tactical blunder, perhaps, especially given the massive language barrier will still exist between these disparate groups of soldiers. Perhaps communication breakdowns within the Russian battalion could be the reason why Ukraine experienced such massive success over the course of just 2 days. That's speculation. But what we know for sure is that an entire Russian battalion containing a substantial number of North Korean soldiers now lies decimated on the Kursk battleground. The news comes on the back of more reports, this time from Ukrainian military commander-in-chief Alexander Syrsky, that suggest that Russia's counteroffensive in Kursk isn't going to plan. As we mentioned earlier, Putin amassed 50,000 soldiers to retake the territory. According to a January 1st Telegram post by Syrsky, Russia's losses had surpassed 38,000 in the oblast even before Ukraine decimated the predominantly North Korean battalion. Zelensky's report also comes on the back of another from South Korea's spy agency that Ukraine had managed to capture an injured North Korean soldier in Kursk. Unfortunately, that soldier died of his injuries while in Ukrainian custody, meaning Ukraine likely couldn't get any valuable information out of him about Putin's Kursk counteroffensive. Still, all of this adds up to one clear conclusion. Putin's use of North Korean soldiers in Kursk isn't going as well as he'd hoped. And that shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody who understands the state these North Korean soldiers were in when they arrived in Russia. The London Evening Standard published a report claiming that North Korea's soldiers still hadn't joined the Kursk counteroffensive as of December 6th. The reason was simple: they were so poorly trained that they could barely even serve as cannon fodder for Putin's meat grinder. One Western official said, "We say due to poor training and lack of logistical support as the primary reasons why DPRK, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, haven't started the fight yet." Instead, North Korea's troops were taking up secondary positions in areas held by Russian soldiers, clearing the way for those Russians to push forward while leaving the North Koreans behind in defense. That's clearly changed now. North Korean soldiers are on the front lines in Kursk and they're dying in droves. This is despite the fact that North Korea supposedly sent its elite soldiers to Russia. It's believed that a large portion of the 12,000 North Korean soldiers that arrived in Russia were part of the country's Special Forces Storm Corps. These are supposedly the best of the best that the North Korean military has to offer, but best is a relative term. As a North Korean defector named Hanul revealed to the BBC on December 20th, the Storm Corps may be the best that North Korea has to offer, but that still puts them a long way behind Ukraine's battle-hardened forces in Kursk. Hanul, who spent several years in North Korea's army before his escape, says that the Storm Corps were the most well-fed soldiers in the country's military. But again, this is a relative term. During his time in the Storm Corps, Hanul lost 22 pounds within a month on nothing but a diet of moldy cabbage and cracked corn. After 3 months, his entire battalion was undernourished to the point where it had to go to a special recovery center to gain weight. And when these supposedly elite Storm Corps were deployed for the first time as frontline guards, the food situation didn't get any better. Rice may have replaced corn, but there wasn't much of it by the time the food reached Hanul's unit. Rear units siphoned away most of the rice, with what reached the Storm Corps being cut with sand to make it seem like a decent meal. These are the elite soldiers North Korea sent to Russia. Underfed troops that were so malnourished that they could barely operate. But hey, at least the Storm Corps undergo more rigorous training than the rest of North Korea's soldiers, right? Well, not so much. Another North Korean defector from the unit, Lee Hyung-sung, says that the DPRK only selects the tallest and most athletic people to become part of the Storm Corps. Lee even had a hand in training them, claiming that he taught the soldiers martial arts and how to create makeshift weapons out of kitchen utensils. But that sort of training isn't going to amount to much in Kursk, where Putin is feeding his North Korean soldiers into the same kind of meat grinder he's created in Ukraine. The Storm Corps needs to know how to use weapons effectively, and that's another area where North Korea's elite fall, according to Hanul. During his time with the unit, he claims to have only fired 3 live rounds during a single training session. He, along with most in the Storm Corps, never raised his gun in anger. The closest he came, says Hanul, was an encounter with a farmer who strayed into a Korean demilitarized zone on the hunt for food. Hanul sent the farmer on his way, breaking protocol to shoot any intruders in the process, and his gun remained unfired. That's all a far cry away from the propaganda videos of the Storm Corps, which show them shattering entire blocks of ice with their bare hands and pulling chains off walls. And it gives us some much-needed
context as to why Ukraine was able to wipe out an entire battalion of these supposed super soldiers in just 2 days of fighting in Kursk. The Storm Corps aren't elite soldiers. They're barely even regularly trained soldiers. North Korea's troops are little more than poorly trained and underfed minions that not even Putin felt confident enough to send to the front lines as cannon fodder when he first received them. And even with some extra training from Russia, those soldiers still have to deal with the language barrier and the fact that they're fighting against Ukrainian troops that have spent years defending against Russian soldiers. The North Koreans never stood a chance. That's why an entire battalion of them now lies in tatters. Worse yet for North Korea, the Storm Corps are supposed to specialize in infiltration. They reportedly trained to find their way behind enemy lines and wreak havoc with the enemy, only that's not happening either. Putin is sending these soldiers to the front lines in Kursk, and he's reaping the results that everyone expected. His North Korean soldiers are dying or getting injured in droves because they're not up to standard, and Putin is using them in a way to which they're unaccustomed. It's all just more evidence of the tactical ineptitude Russia has shown throughout Putin's entire special military operation, and it leaves us with a question to ask: what happens next? The odds are pretty high that even more deaths and casualties of North Korean soldiers await us. Putin isn't going to stop his Kursk counteroffensive until he's retaken the lost territory or exhausted his troops. The latter scenario is starting to look more likely than the former, especially when you consider what's happening to Russia's North Korean soldiers beyond this most recent loss of an entire battalion. A day after Zelensky revealed the destruction of the North Korean battalion, he appeared on American podcaster Lex Fridman's show. The interview became prickly at times, especially when Friedman suggested that Ukraine could simply try forgiving Putin to bring an end to the war. Zelensky quickly shut down that suggestion by pointing out that nobody could reasonably consider forgiving anybody who had killed thousands of his country's people and decimated so many cities. But even amidst the tension of the interview, Zelensky revealed just how effective Ukraine has been against the North Korean forces which it fights in Kursk. He revealed that around 3,800 North Korean soldiers have already been killed or injured in the region so far. For those keeping count, that amounts to roughly a third of the 12,000 troops North Korea is believed to have sent to Russia. We've already touched on some of the reasons why North Korea's casualty rate is so high. Their elite troops are nothing of the sort, and the soldiers Russia has received are poorly trained. But there's another reason why so many North Korean soldiers are dying. According to White House National Security Council spokesman John Kirby, Putin has been using these soldiers to carry out human wave attacks against Ukrainian positions. Often left to attack on foot with minimal support and shoddy weaponry, the North Koreans are now being used as cannon fodder to soak up Ukrainian ammo. Putin's idea is simple here. The more ammunition Ukraine expends on North Korean soldiers, the less it'll have to defend against attacks by more competent Russian troops. The situation is so bad for North Korea's soldiers that many are resorting to taking their own lives ahead of being captured by Ukraine in Kursk. Kirby speculates that this is because many fear for the lives of their families back home. After all, they live in a country that monitors practically everything they do. That monitoring hasn't stopped because the soldiers are now in Russia. Some North Koreans are dying by their own hands because they'd rather be reported as dying honorably in battle to reduce the risk of North Korean President Kim Jong-un taking revenge on their families. There is some disparity in these North Korean casualty figures. Back in late December, Zelensky claimed that Ukraine had killed or wounded over 3,000 North Koreans. So it's added around 800 to the North Korean casualty count in a little over a week, if Ukraine is to be believed. But at the same time, South Korea believed North Korea's casualty rate was closer to 1,100, accounting for about a tenth of the soldiers Kim sent to Putin. Either way, these are massive losses. The destruction of an entire battalion could add up to 1,000 to these numbers. Assuming that Ukraine's late December tally of 3,000 was accurate, it would make sense that the number is now around 3,800 following the wiping out of the battalion. And loss has been the story of North Korea in Kursk. Even back in mid-December, when Putin was just starting to roll his North Korean soldiers out onto the front line in Kursk, the losses had started mounting up. A single clash with Ukraine's defense forces between December 14th and 15th cost North Korea at least 30 of its soldiers. The casualties have only ramped up from there as Putin pushes more of Kim's soldiers to the front. So we know that the North Korean soldiers aren't going to stop coming until their numbers are completely depleted. Putin's human wave approach means most of Kim's soldiers are going to die as little more than cannon fodder for the meat grinder. Even those who seek escape will kill themselves ahead of being captured or deserting for fear of what might happen to their loved ones back home. At this rate, we could expect the entire North Korean contingent of 12,000 soldiers to be exhausted by the end of March or the beginning of April. If Putin hasn't retaken the lost Kursk territory by then, Russia will be left in a very bad position. Zelensky certainly has his ideas about what should happen next after the destruction of the North Korean battalion. It's something he's called for since late 2024. Ukraine's president wants China to use its influence over North Korea to prevent the deployment of more of Kim's soldiers.
Zelensky may see the wiping out of this battalion and the 3,800 casualties Ukraine has inflicted on North Korea so far as a message to the DPRK and China. North Korea would do well to stop sending soldiers, or they'll face the same fate as those who came before. The Korean people should not lose their people in battles in Europe, Zelensky has claimed in the past while talking about China's potential influence. If China is sincere in its statements that the war should not expand, appropriate influences on Pyongyang is necessary. China has certainly made those claims. Back in September 2024, the country's foreign minister Wang Yi even stood before the United Nations to warn fellow world leaders against an expanding Ukrainian battlefield. The top priority is to commit to no expansion of the battlefield. China is committed to playing a constructive role, claimed the minister at the time. But just a couple of months later saw the very expansion that China claimed shouldn't happen as Russia started fielding North Korean troops. Still, what China says and what it does are often two very different things. Ukraine likely can't rely on China to apply any sort of pressure on North Korea in the wake of the battalion destruction. The loss of the troops alone may have to do that. The East Asia Forum says that China is unlikely to condemn Russia's use of North Korean troops, even if it's wary of the strengthening of the relationship between Putin and Kim that the use of these soldiers represents. Ukraine's other option is to keep building on the battalion decimation. There are plenty of signs that it's doing so already. Zelensky was slated to attend the 25th meeting of the Defense Contact Group as we were writing this script. Held at the Ramstein Air Base in Germany, the meeting brought together over 50 nations, collectively known as the Ramstein Group, to discuss the security matters of the day. Most members of this group are also NATO and European Union members, with the group having been formed in April 2022 in the wake of Putin's Ukraine invasion. This particular iteration of the meeting was supposed to take place on October 2024. It was postponed as President Joe Biden had to make time to deal with the aftermath of Hurricane Milton. Right now, the meeting represents the last chance Zelensky has to gain more support from Ukraine's allies, especially America, before President-elect Donald Trump takes office. Zelensky is trying to butter Trump up before he takes office, even taking to Ukrainian television to say that Trump can be decisive and that he's capable of helping Ukraine to stop Putin in his tracks. But you have to imagine that Zelensky will use the 25th Ramstein meeting group to secure a few more donations of military equipment that his country can use in its defense of Kursk. Speaking of Kursk, Ukraine's also taking things into its own hands by launching a counteroffensive in the oblast. On January 5th, a day after Zelensky announced the destruction of the North Korean battalion, news began to emerge of a renewed Kursk offensive. Rather than sitting back and defending the positions it already held, Ukraine started to launch attacks in several directions in the oblast. Russia's defense ministry claimed it had already repelled 2 of these counterattacks by January 5th. Russia claims that a decisive response included support from artillery and aviation, allowing it to destroy the Ukrainian counterattackers just 9 miles from its border with Ukraine. It's wise to take these claims with a pinch of salt. After all, Ukraine claims the counterattack to Russia's Kursk counteroffensive is going well. CNN reports that Ukrainian presidential office head Andriy Yermak posted to Telegram on January 5th to state, "Kursk region, good news. Russia is getting what it deserves." Regardless, it's clear that Ukraine feels like it's in a position to launch attacks against Russia and its contingent of North Korean soldiers in the wake of destroying an entire battalion in Kursk. Whether the Ukrainian counterattack is the result of renewed confidence or desperation on Ukraine's part remains to be seen, but there's one thing that's almost certain: Russia will continue attacking. And that means North Korea stands to lose even more than the battalion Ukraine decimated on January 4th and the 3,800 or so troops it's lost so far. More human waves means more North Korean deaths, which brings us to the final question we'll ask in this video: will Kim Jong-un send more of his soldiers to fight for Russia in Kursk? Zelensky thinks that's a possibility. During his podcast interview with Lex Fridman, Zelensky said that North Korea has the ability to send an additional 30,000 to 40,000 troops to the Kursk front. That would almost double the entire counterattacking force Putin amassed in his initial push to retake Kursk, with those soldiers adding to the massive meat grinder he's already created. They can bring more, Zelensky told Fridman. 30 or 40,000 or maybe 500. They can bring many people. Why? Because they have order, autocracy and everything. And therein may lie a sign that the worst isn't over for Ukraine yet. It's done an amazing job taking out an entire North Korean battalion in 2 days, along with 3,800 North Koreans throughout Putin's Kursk counteroffensive. But Kim has more soldiers waiting in the wings. And if Radio Free Europe is to be believed, Kim isn't fazed by the North Korean losses so far. If anything, he's preparing to double down on his support for Russia, knowing that every soldier he sends to Putin means he gets more cash, oil, and military secrets in return. So is Ukraine's destruction of a North Korean battalion in Kursk a sign that the battle in the oblast is going in Zelensky's favor? Or could it be the signal Kim and Putin need to ship even more North Korean soldiers into the embattled region? Putin's big plan to save Kursk, it's turning into a disaster. When he signed a deal with North Korea in 2024, Putin thought he had the perfect answer to his problems. Thousands of North Korean soldiers would flood into Kursk, help Russia push Ukraine back, and prove that he wasn't as isolated as the West claimed. He likely pictured himself turning the tide of the war with his so-called allies by his side. Spoiler alert, that's not happening. Instead, his plan is falling apart. North Korea sent up to 12,000 troops to Kursk to join a 50,000-strong counteroffensive aimed at reclaiming territory Ukraine seized in its surprise August invasion. But in just 2 months, Ukraine has decimated over 30% of those troops, exposing just how unprepared and outmatched they are on the battlefield. These weren't just any reinforcements. Putin and Kim Jong-un sold them as elite soldiers. Turns out, they're cannon fodder. In this video, we'll break down what's happening to the North Koreans in Kursk, why they're failing so miserably, and what it all means for Putin's desperate war effort. We start with a question. How do we know that Ukraine has destroyed a third of the North Korean contingent in Kursk? The answer is that it all came directly out of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's mouth. On January 5, 2025, Zelensky appeared on an episode of the Lex Fridman podcast. That episode, which already has over 4 million views on YouTube, saw Ukraine's president speak on topics as varied as potentially meeting President-elect Donald Trump, the potential upcoming peace negotiations with Russia, and the future of Ukraine. But one of the most illuminating portions of the podcast saw Zelensky talk about what's happening in Kursk right now. Kursk is an evolving battlefield. When Ukraine launched its August 2024 counter-invasion into the Russian oblast, it quickly snatched up territory and settlements. Within a couple of weeks, Ukraine held around 90 settlements and 450 square miles of land, almost equaling the amount of territory Russia has managed to take in Ukraine between January and August 2024. Putin was naturally furious. His own poor defenses had allowed the invasion to happen, with the loss of land being the first to occur in Russia since World War II. But Putin was slow on the draw to do anything about it at first. It wasn't until around November that he started preparing a counteroffensive in earnest, and it soon became apparent why he waited so long. Russia's Kursk counteroffensive was going to include the 12,000 or so soldiers shipped to the country from North Korea a month prior. The cooperative defense pact with Kim had been triggered, and Russia had a source of new soldiers. Fast forward to today, and Zelensky revealed exactly what's happening to those 12,000 North Korean troops. 12,000 have arrived, Zelensky told Friedman. Today, 3,800 killed or wounded. It's the largest estimate delivered yet for the number of casualties experienced by North Korean soldiers in Kursk, and it amounts to over 30% of the attacking force Kim sent to Putin. Other sources seem to be sharing similar numbers. As Business Insider reports, the US believed that Ukraine managed to take out over 1,000 North Korean soldiers in a single week in December, thanks in large part to those soldiers being part of mass dismounted attacks. In other words, North Koreans are being sent in on foot to attack well-fortified Ukrainian positions, and they're being cut down in the hundreds. Zelensky didn't offer up these figures to brag about the power of the Ukrainian military versus North Korea's. He believes that North Korea shouldn't even be a part of the fight at all. Toward the end of December, Ukraine's president spoke about the significance of North Korea's losses during one of his nightly video addresses. He said that the North Korean troops should not be losing their lives in battles in Europe, before calling on China to influence Pyongyang into keeping its soldiers out of Russia. Still, there was context to the North Korean casualty figures beyond Zelensky attempting to scare Kim away. Zelensky's appearance on Fridman's podcast comes just a couple of weeks before President-elect Donald Trump is set to take office. Trump was a key focus of the 3-hour discussion, with Business Insider suggesting that Zelensky offered up the North Korean casualty rate figures as part of a larger argument about the dangers presented to Europe if the US leaves NATO. Less support for NATO means more opportunities for Russia to use foreign soldiers to overrun other countries. Zelensky wants to make it clear that Ukraine is already doing what NATO is supposed to do. Trump choosing to have the US leave NATO at such a critical juncture would so substantially weaken Europe that Putin would feel confident enough to welcome even more of Kim's troops into his country. Or as Zelensky more pointedly put it, Putin will destroy Europe if Trump chooses to leave NATO. After all, Europe is less able to quickly raise massive armies than North Korea, claims Ukraine's leader. North Korea, being an autocracy, many would say a dictatorship, means its people can be called upon to go and fight at a moment's notice. Can Europe bring people together? No, claims Zelensky. Will Europe be able to build an army consisting of 2 to 3 million people? No, Europe will not want to do this. That's why Ukraine's president is still pushing for the US to send more weapons, even as his troops decimate the North Korean soldiers. In late December, he said, "It's very important that the United States is currently increasing supplies. when speaking about more military aid from the US. "This is necessary to balance the situation. I am grateful to our partners. The pace of supply must become such as to disrupt the pace of Russian assaults." The speed of Russia's assaults have only been enhanced by its access to North Korean troops, which is why it's so important that Ukraine is inflicting such heavy casualties. So the 3,800 figure isn't a boast by Ukraine's leader. Instead, he's trying to show the rest of the world, particularly the US, the sheer scale of the threat North Korea now poses to Europe. Those 3,800 foreign soldiers are just a third of what Kim has sent to Putin. And if Trump decides to withdraw the US from NATO, Zelensky appears to be arguing, it will just mean a massive door is left open for Putin to terrorize Europe with even more North Korean soldiers. Still, 3,800 North Korean casualties is a lot, considering those troops have only been involved in the fighting in Kursk for a little over 2 months. That leads us to an obvious question. Why are so many North Korean soldiers dying in droves during Russia's counteroffensive against Ukraine? There are a few reasons, starting with Putin's intention when he brought those troops into Russia in the first place. He sees them as little more than cannon fodder. The opinion has been shared multiple times since Putin welcomed Kim's soldiers into Russia. Reporting in early November 2024, The Independent pointed out that many of the leaders of the countries in the Group of Seven, or G7, feel that Russia's decision to bring in North Korean troops was a sign of desperation. To them, Putin is trying to bolster his numbers in any way he can during a war that's already seen Russia experience around 803,000 casualties. Daily troop losses are hovering around the 1,500 to 2,000 mark, and have already broken the 2,000 barrier several times in November and December, meaning that Russia is dealing with a massive soldier churn rate. Putin needs bodies to make up the numbers, and that's precisely what the North Korean soldiers are, according to a former first lieutenant in the North Korean army named Choi Jong-hoon. Speaking to The Independent, he says, "None would think that they are going to Russia to die," when speaking about Putin's North Korean soldiers. "But I think they're cannon fodder because they will be sent to the most dangerous sites and will surely be killed." What we're seeing with this massive number of North Korean deaths is that Choi was right. The North Korean soldiers arriving in Russia, which apparently included 500 officers, 3 generals, and members of North Korea's so-called elite Storm Corps, have no direct combat experience. They've faced nothing more than North Korea's haphazard military training, more on that later, and they had no idea what they would be stepping into once they reached the front lines in Kursk. Zelensky agreed with Choi's opinion after Ukraine inflicted the first few of what would become 3,800 casualties on the North Korean forces. He told Japan's Kyodo news agency that early signs indicated Putin intended to use Kim's soldiers as cannon fodder. South Korea's defense minister, Kim Yong-hyun, said the same thing during a press briefing with the US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin in October 2024. Kim Jong-un doesn't hesitate to sell out his young people and troops as cannon fodder mercenaries. But all of these claims came before North Korean troops started deploying in earnest in Kursk. Has the reality of the fighting matched the expectation? It absolutely has. About a week before Zelensky made the 3,800 casualties claim on Friedman's podcast, National Security Council spokesperson John Kirby said that Putin was using his North Korean soldiers as part of human wave assaults. These attacks involve sending in masses of soldiers, often on foot, to attack Ukrainian defensive positions. The Ukrainian troops shot the first wave down, only to see it followed by another and then another, all with the intent of forcing Ukraine to burn through its ammunition. Kirby said the North Korean soldiers are being sent into these hopeless assaults, which is why over 1,000 were killed or injured in the week leading up to December 28, 2024. Putin's tactical ineptitude is also why North Korea lost 3,800 soldiers before the end of the first week of January 2025. There's also North Korean indoctrination to consider when looking for reasons why so many North Koreans are dying in Kursk. The soldiers Putin has received are told that it's far better to die on the battlefield than it is to be captured by Ukrainian forces. That's why we've seen so few captures thus far. Ukraine says it's managed to take a handful of North Koreans as prisoners, only to see them die soon after. According to Zelensky, all were severely wounded and it was not possible to save their lives. Kirby believes that many North Korean soldiers are choosing to commit suicide on the battlefield rather than allow their own capture. Why? Likely out of fear of reprisal against their families in the event that they're captured, claims Kirby. The precise number of North Koreans who've chosen death by their own hands ahead of capture isn't clear. However, Kirby's comments cast a whole new light on what one of Kim's soldiers faces when they arrive in Russia. These are soldiers whose entire lives are monitored back home. When they arrive in Russia, that monitoring continues through the 500 or so officers North Korea has sent as part of the 12,000 troops. What choice does a North Korean soldier have in that situation? They're trained never to be captured by the enemy, and they know they're being watched at all times. Stepping out of line will lead to terrible repercussions against their families if Kirby is to be believed. So a North Korean soldier on the front lines in Kursk either has to rush headlong as part of Putin's human wave attacks, knowing that they're likely going to be shredded by Ukrainian bullets and artillery or kill themselves if they face the prospect of capture. Choice seems to be between death and death, and that only emphasizes how Russia, and perhaps even North Korea, views these soldiers as cannon fodder to be sent to the slaughter. A third of these North Koreans are already dead, because dying is the entire reason they were brought to Russia in the first place. Well, that and the fact that none of these North Korean troops were particularly well trained to begin with. Therein lies another reason a third of North Korea's forces in Kursk are already dead or injured. They don't know how to fight. We touched on this earlier when we noted that none of the 12,000 soldiers will have ever seen any sort of direct combat engagement with an enemy. All of their knowledge comes from training, and that's simply nowhere near the standards expected of a modern military. Former member of North Korea's Storm Corps and modern-day defector Hanul revealed as much to the BBC in December 2024. He says that even the elite of North Korea's army are underfed, surviving on a diet of moldy cabbage and cracked corn during training and graduating to rice cut with sand once they're deployed. Those soldiers barely even fire bullets when they're in training, with Hanul claiming to have only shot 3 live rounds before he was deployed to the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea. As for other training, another Storm Corps defector named Lee Hyun-sung says that he used to teach his soldiers martial arts and how to make weapons out of kitchen utensils. North Korean soldiers are training on how to bring knives and forks to an artillery and drone fight. That lack of training impacted what Putin could do with the North Koreans he received from Kim and reinforces the reason why so many have been used as cannon fodder against Ukraine. They weren't good enough to be anything else, and to make matters worse, the North Korean soldiers started to pick up bad habits once they arrived in Russia. That's according to a December 2024 article in The Telegraph. It says that people are cheap in general to Putin, and that goes double for his North Korean soldiers. When those troops arrive in Kursk, they're trained to mirror the human wave assaults the bulk of Russia's forces have been using in Ukraine. Infantry attacks Ukrainian positions on foot, just as Kirby claims. When a combination of Ukrainian mines, artillery, and drones wipe those soldiers out, the next wave rolls in. The North Korean soldiers are being taught little more than to walk forward to their deaths, and if Hanul is to be believed, they're barely capable of raising their rifles in anger should the opportunity to actually kill a Ukrainian present itself. As if to emphasize North Korea's complete lack of training, notebooks found on the bodies of dead soldiers reveal what Russia is teaching them when they arrive. On December 26th, Radio Free Asia reported that Ukraine had recovered a notebook from the body of a killed North Korean soldier named Jong Kyung-hong. Within its pages lay diagrams denoting the strategy these soldiers have been taught to deal with Ukrainian drone attacks. When a drone is spotted, form a team of 3, reads Jong's notes. That team of 3 includes one person as bait, who is supposed to lure the drone out of position by standing at least 23 feet away from it. The other 2 people then come up on the drone's rear, standing between 32 and 40 feet away in an attempt to shoot it down. Bear in mind that most of these soldiers have barely fired any live rounds in their training. They're now being taught to use themselves as bait in the vain hope that one of their comrades will somehow score a bullseye on a fast-moving drone before that drone shreds them to pieces or unleashes an explosive on their position. It's a ridiculous strategy. But it seems to be good enough for Russia when dealing with soldiers that it sees as little more than meat to feed into the ever-churning grinder in Kursk. A third of North Korea's soldiers are dead because of their lack of training combined with poor strategy upon arrival, and Putin's view that they're little more than cannon fodder. With that, we come to the final reason why 3,800 North Korean soldiers are dead or wounded in Kursk. Ukraine just has too much for these soldiers to handle. Poor training and Putin's cannon fodder attitude have combined to put North Korean soldiers in a position where they simply can't win against Ukraine's battle-hardened forces. We've seen that from the very first moment that troops from the two sides started clashing. When Ukraine had its first confirmed combat engagement with North Korean forces in early November 2024, it was the Ukrainians who went on the attack. That incident didn't lead to direct combat, but every engagement since has. By mid-December 2024, the US was reporting on the first North Korean casualties as a result of their deployment in Kursk, stating that at least 30 soldiers were killed or injured during a single weekend. It's only been getting worse from there for North Korea. As we mentioned earlier, North Korean troops are now being deployed in such massive numbers that it's possible for Ukraine to inflict over 1,000 casualties on them per week. In some cases, it's pulling close to those casualty numbers in a matter of days. On January 5th, reports emerged that Ukraine had destroyed an entire battalion, consisting primarily of North Korean soldiers, over the previous 2 days. For context, a battalion typically contains about 1,000 soldiers, meaning Ukraine may have ramped up its North Korean decimation to the point where it may be just a couple of months until Kim's troops are exhausted. And Ukraine doesn't look to be slowing down anytime soon. It's in the midst of a counteroffensive in Kursk at the time of this video's creation. On January 7th, the Kyiv Post reported that the Ukrainian Special Operations Forces, or SSO, had killed more than a dozen North Korean soldiers during a single gunfight, resulting from that counteroffensive. Posting to its Telegram channel, the SSO said that it had killed 5 North Koreans in a gunfight, with a further 8 dying due to drone strikes. We guess the bait and surround tactics taught to Kim's soldiers by Russia weren't much use after all. Documents recovered from the bodies after the fight revealed that one of the dead soldiers was an officer in the North Korean army, showing us that even the best Kim has to offer can't do much in the face of Ukraine's attacks. We conclude with one more question. What happens now that 3,800 North Koreans and counting are dead or wounded in Kursk? The odds are that Kim is going to double down on his relationship with Putin. That shouldn't come as a surprise. North Korea has to be getting something in return for the soldiers it's shipping over to Russia, with that something likely to be a combination of oil, money, and military secrets. All 3 are high-value items for President Kim, which is why it's believed that he's about to start rotating his troops in Russia. That's according to Dmytro Ponomarenko, Ukraine's ambassador to South Korea. He said back in November that the number of North Korean soldiers in Russia could reach 15,000 soon, with those soldiers being on a rotation schedule that sees them rotated out of circulation every 2 to 3 months. If we assume a 2-month rotation, that will mean 6 fresh batches of 15,000 soldiers annually, amounting to around 90,000 soldiers in total over the course of a year. Again, we come back to the purpose behind Zelensky revealing the 3,800 casualties to Friedman during his podcast interview. If North Korea is going to start rotating, as the Lowy Institute suggests Kim wants to do, to further entrench his country's alliance with Russia, then Europe may soon face a massive North Korean problem. Losing America from NATO when Kim wants to send more soldiers to Russia could lead to North Korea ingratiating itself further into the global geopolitical community on the back of whatever settlement Putin might negotiate with Zelensky if the war comes to an end. In other words, the anti-West will get stronger if the 3,800 dead or wounded are just the beginning. But what do you think about Ukraine taking out a third of North Korea's soldiers in Kursk? Is this a sign that Putin's tactics are failing, and is Kim going to send more troops? Brutality. If there's one word that underpins Russia's approach to the Ukraine war, it would be brutality. Putin's regime has relied on a meat grinder approach that has cost Russia's army close to 800,000 people. It's according to Ukraine's Ministry of Finance. And nothing has changed with the arrival of North Korean soldiers in the Kursk region. If anything, these new soldiers face a level of brutality that no other troops have experienced so far during the war. Brutality so severe that they're executing their own just to prevent them from being captured alive by Ukraine's forces. But what is actually happening among the North Korean troops currently taking part in Putin's counteroffensive in Ukraine? And why are those soldiers executing their comrades? We answer those questions in this video, starting with the execution claims. Toward the end of December 2024, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky made the remarkable claim that North Korean soldiers are brutally executing their own to prevent them from being captured by Ukrainian forces. Worse yet for Ukraine, the few North Koreans it has managed to capture have been so severely injured that they couldn't be resuscitated. They died before Ukraine could extract any information from them. Everything is arranged in a way that makes it impossible for us to capture the Koreans as prisoners, Zelensky claims. Their own people are executing them. There are such cases, adds Ukraine's president before he points out that Russia is sending North Korean soldiers into assaults against Ukrainian positions with minimal protection. Zelensky also says that those few North Koreans who are captured seem to have been wounded by their own people to prevent them from talking. Today, we received reports on several soldiers from North Korea. Our warriors managed to capture them, but they were seriously wounded and could not be resuscitated. Zelensky goes on to call what's happening one of the manifestations of madness of a dictatorial regime. The implication is clear. Putin doesn't care about the North Korean troops he's sending to Kursk. They're just more meat to feed into his grinder, with those troops being so vulnerable that they see no other way out of the fight than to die. It makes little difference whether those deaths comes at Ukrainian hands or their own. This isn't to say that Ukraine has been wholly unsuccessful in capturing North Korean soldiers. Toward the end of December, news emerged that Ukraine had managed to capture its first soldier from the country. This is the first in a string of captures and killings, claimed Asan Institute for Policy Studies research fellow Yang Uk. For Ukrainians, it's more beneficial to capture these North Korean troops and try to exchange them with Russians for Ukrainian prisoners of war. Only those exchanges aren't happening. As the BBC reported on December 27th, the first captured North Korean soldier died while in captivity. The soldier's injuries were too severe, leading to him becoming one of the many mass casualties that are occurring among his countrymen in Kursk. This particular soldier wasn't executed before he entered Ukrainian hands, but he may as well have been. And that brings us to another question. Why are North Korean soldiers killing each other rather than risk being taken prisoner by Ukraine? The first of several answers to this question comes from the brutal tactics Putin has been employing during the Kursk counteroffensive. This operation, which is intended to push out the Ukrainian forces that invaded the Russian oblast back in August, has seen Putin rely on his human wave approach of simply throwing soldier after soldier at Ukrainian positions to soak up the ammo. Footage captured from the Kursk battlefield shows North Korean soldiers taking up massed positions while being provided with minimal protection from their Russian masters. Naturally, that makes the North Koreans vulnerable to airstrikes, and worse yet for these soldiers, their massed formations run contrary to how Russia is deploying its own troops. Where the North Koreans are forced to huddle together in large and easily targetable groups, their supposed Russian comrades operate in smaller teams that are far less exposed to Ukrainian firepower. Speaking on December 27th, White House National Security Council advisor John Kirby said that the North Korean troops were engaged in massed dismounted assaults. The use of the word dismounted suggests that the soldiers are being sent to assault Ukrainian positions on foot. Kirby also claims that the North Koreans are highly indoctrinated, meaning they will carry out their assaults even knowing that they will likely march to their deaths. Those tactics are leading to heavy casualties for North Korea, Kirby claims. But the soldiers' approach to Putin's brutal strategy also offers some insight into why there are now North Koreans executing each other on the battlefield. Putin is taking advantage of their indoctrination. He's able to send those North Korean soldiers to assault dangerous positions on foot because he knows the soldiers won't argue. They won't point out his tactical ineptitude. So heavily indoctrinated are they that they will even kill themselves to avoid falling into Ukrainian hands, both to protect their honor and to prevent Ukraine from proving that North Koreans are actually in the country. This approach makes the North Korean soldiers dangerous enemies for Ukraine. How are you supposed to counter an attacker who is so willing to die for their cause that they'll attack on foot simply to soak up your ammunition to clear the way for Russian forces on the back end? That's a question for which Ukraine needs to find an answer. However, indoctrination isn't the only powerful force compelling North Korean troops to either execute their own or commit suicide on the front lines. Those soldiers also know that failure to fulfill their duty of dying based on Putin's whims could lead to their families being targeted back home. Kirby said as much during his December 27th address. He noted that North Koreans were committing suicide and executing their own, likely out of fear of reprisal against their families in North Korea in the event they're captured. Don't underestimate the impact that placing pressure on families will have on these North Korean soldiers. Speaking to Voice of America back in November 2024, North Korean defector and former People's Army Lieutenant Kim Jong-ah says that the mothers of those who've been forced to send their children to Kursk can't even express their grief back home. North Korean mothers who sent their children to Russia must feel unimaginable pain, said Kim. They cannot even cry as hard as you want at home because there's no soundproof walls between houses. That comment reveals the extent of the surveillance state that North Korean President Kim Jong-un has created in the country. Mothers forced to send their children to Russia must hide their sorrow due to pressure placed upon them by the regime under which they live. For the North Korean soldiers in Kursk, that surveillance likely manifests in reports on their actions on the Russian battlefield. If a North Korean soldier doesn't perform as expected, meaning they don't die on Putin's command, the mothers back home who attempt to grieve publicly may face many more problems. It's coercion in its most basic form. And it shows us why so many North Koreans in Kursk choose suicide or execution ahead of being captured by Ukraine's forces. To be captured is to fail Putin, and that failure could lead to Kim Jong-un enacting revenge against those the soldier left behind. So it's better to die by your own comrade's hand than it is to give North Korea's leader an excuse to target your family. Now we have two reasons why North Koreans are executing each other in Kursk. The soldiers are so heavily indoctrinated thanks to their time serving in North Korea's People's Army that many believe it's their duty to die on the battlefield. That's why they'll assault Ukrainian positions on foot, knowing they have no chance of winning. They're willing to die rather than be captured. But accompanying that indoctrination is a terrible form of coercion. Every North Korean soldier in Kursk knows that they're being watched. Even if they don't feel duty-bound to die in Putin's war, they'll still do it because they want to protect their loved ones back home. If that means killing yourself or your comrades to prevent capture, then so be it. And that brings us to the third reason North Korean soldiers are killing each other in Ukraine. They know that they are expendable. The North Korean military is involved in the fighting, Zelensky says when reporting on what's happening in the Kursk region. They have many losses, a great deal, and we can see that the Russian military and the North Korean enforcers have no interest in the survival of these Koreans at all. That lack of care from command is another reason why some North Korean soldiers feel compelled to kill each other rather than be captured by Ukraine. They know, whether it's stated or not by their commanders, that their purpose in Kursk is to die. North Korean soldiers are left isolated in large groups and, as Kirby noted, are being pushed into assaults on foot. They are expendable. and the early numbers coming in from Kursk show exactly how little Russian and North Korean command cares for their rank-and-file North Korean soldiers. Zelensky claims that Ukraine has already killed or wounded 3,000 of the 12,000 North Korean soldiers in Kursk, meaning it will have taken out about a quarter of the forces in a matter of weeks. Kirby says the figure is a little more modest, stating that Ukraine has killed around 1,000 North Koreans. South Korea reports similar figures. Either way, it's a massive death rate that showcases the expendable nature of these troops. Again, the indoctrination comes into play here, with Kirby noting that the soldiers are pushing attacks even when it's clear that those attacks are futile. Imagine what seeing these figures would feel like as a North Korean being pushed into on-foot assaults in Kursk. The mere fact that you're going into fight with minimal protection tells you all you need to know about how command views you. It also tells you that command will be very unhappy if you are captured. You're expendable. Your role is to die to serve Putin's purpose. Allowing yourself to be captured is the very opposite of what you're supposed to do, and it simply can't be allowed. So if you or one of your comrades is at risk of being captured, it's far better to execute than it is to fall into Ukrainian hands. And as if to reinforce the North Korean soldiers' collective purpose in Kursk, the tactics they've been taught to defend themselves are practically useless. That's according to Ukraine's drone operators, who say that the evidence they've seen suggests that North Korean soldiers are clearly untrained in how to deal with unmanned aerial vehicles or UAVs. That lack of training has led to at least one instance of a North Korean soldier accidentally shooting a comrade while trying to destroy a drone that was filming them. Even when the North Koreans aren't purposefully executing one another, their lack of training is leading to some of them dying. The extent of their training deficiencies was revealed in a notebook recovered from the body of a North Korean soldier on the Kursk battlefield. Al Jazeera reports that the book contained a strategy for dealing with UAVs. When detecting a drone, you need to create a trio where the one who lures the drone keeps a distance of 7 meters, and those who shoot it 10 to 12 meters, read the notes. If the one who is luring stands still, the drone will also stop its movement. At this moment, the one who is shooting will eliminate the drone. It's a frankly ridiculous strategy that boils down to a North Korean soldier having to use themselves as bait so their comrades can tackle the drone. It's also a strategy that seems to rely on the drone stopping and simply hovering near the bait, rather than attacking or exploding. This hopeless tactic is indicative of what North Korea's soldiers face when heading into Kursk. They have no protection. They're fighting on foot and assembled in easily targetable masses. And as for the strategies they're being taught by Russia, these notes reveal that their tactics are to stand in front of deadly weapons and hope they don't get killed. This bait-and-shoot approach again highlights how expendable North Korea's soldiers are in Kursk. They simply don't matter to command, as long as they don't get captured. Knowing how expendable they are and how they're expected to follow through on orders no matter how ridiculous they seem, gives us another reason why North Koreans are executing each other on the battlefield. They're there to die. It almost doesn't matter who kills them. All of the reasons why North Korean soldiers are killing each other in Kursk hint at the factor that likely plays the biggest role in these executions. Russia wants to cover up its use of North Korean soldiers in Kursk. It's worth noting at this point that neither Russia nor North Korea have confirmed the deployment of North Korean soldiers in Russia, but it's clearly happening. There's more than enough independent evidence to show us that. But Putin and Kim are acting as though it isn't, with any acknowledgement being indirect and failing to expound on why the soldiers are really there. Putin wants to use this lack of acknowledgement as an intimidation tactic. In late October 2024, Russia's leader was asked about satellite images released by South Korean intelligence that showed North Korean soldiers heading to Russia. All Putin would say is, "Images are a serious thing. If there are images, they reflect something." What that something was is clear to the rest of the world now, even if Putin won't come out and say it. Still, Russia is trying to hide the fact that it has North Korean soldiers fighting in Kursk, and that desire to hide it has led to some truly horrific actions on the battlefield. Russia is burning the faces of dead North Korean soldiers to prevent them from being identified. That's according to Zelensky, who expanded on Russia's desire to keep the presence of North Korean soldiers in Kursk a secret on December 14, 2024. While they're being trained, they were even forbidden to show their faces. The Russian military tried to delete any video evidence of their presence, Ukraine's president claimed via his Telegram channel. And now, after the battle with our guys, the Russians are also trying to literally burn the faces of the dead North Korean soldiers. The claim was accompanied by a 30-second video in which a group of what appears to be Russian soldiers can be seen burning a corpse on a snow-covered hill. It's a terrifying cover-up, one in which Russia will go out of its way to destroy any evidence that North Korean troops are in Kursk. And it's this cover-up that reveals why the indoctrination, expendability, and threats against North Korean soldiers' families work so well for Russia. The soldiers Russia has received from President Kim know that they can't be caught. Being caught means they become physical evidence of North Korea's presence in Kursk. So North Korean troops execute their own in a vain effort to support Putin's illusion. They die by their own hands because they believe that executing one another means that the rest of the world will never know they were there. Of course, that's completely wrong. By this point, everybody knows that there are North Korean soldiers in Kursk. Russia can burn troops' faces. North Koreans can execute each other to hide the fact. But none of it works, with Putin's cover-up seeming to exist solely so he can create uncertainty within Ukraine's ranks. So we now have 4 reasons why North Korean soldiers are killing each other, and sometimes themselves, in Kursk. They're so heavily indoctrinated that they are willing to die for Putin's special military operation on Kim's orders. They're also treated and likely recognize themselves as expendable, meaning they already know they're only in Kursk to die. And even those who might consider rebelling against their indoctrination know that running from the situation would only lead to repercussions for their families. Thus, it's better to die in Kursk than to see their loved ones suffer back home. And all of this is underpinned by Putin's strange desire to keep the North Koreans' presence in Kursk a secret, despite the world knowing what's going on. But there may be one final reason why North Korean soldiers are executing each other rather than allowing Ukraine to capture them: Russian propaganda. Putin and his Kremlin cronies have likely been pumping North Korean soldiers full of information about what Ukraine will do to them if they're captured. Torture and slow death are in the soldiers' future, this propaganda might claim. And Putin would even be able to point to evidence gathered by the United Nations or UN as proof. In October 2024, the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights published a report in which it interviewed 205 Russian prisoners of war, or POWs. Of these 205 POWs, 104 said they had experienced torture or ill treatment during their time in captivity. These incidents typically took place in unofficial or transit locations, including garages, basements, or private houses, where the POWs were detained before being transferred to official facilities. This followed a similar report by the UN in November 2022, which said that there were credible allegations of the summary execution of Russian prisoners by their Ukrainian captors. These reports would suggest that Ukraine's hands aren't especially clean when it comes to its treatment of POWs. Putin likely uses that to his advantage when dealing with his North Korean soldiers. He's able to point to official UN reports to claim that any captured North Korean will face torture and possible execution by Ukraine. With a little embellishment, Russia could be making the very prospect of being captured seem like it's worse than death, leading to North Korean soldiers executing one another because they're afraid of what might happen to them if they're captured. If that's the case, the North Korean soldiers are truly stuck in an unwinnable situation in their own minds. Getting captured either means being tortured or putting your family and Putin's ambitions at risk, or both. Death may be preferable to both of these scenarios. So what should happen next? To Zelensky, the answer is pretty simple. The Korean nation should not lose its people in the battles of Europe, he says before pointing out that the likes of China may play a key role. If China is sincere in its statements that the war should not escalate, it must exert appropriate pressure on Pyongyang, claims Ukraine's president. Whether or not that happens remains to be seen. But until North Korea is out of Kursk, the odds are that we're going to see more of the country's soldiers committing suicide or executing comrades, all in service of Vladimir Putin's brutal special military operation. But what do you think about what the North Koreans are doing to each other in Kursk? Are these executions going to become more common as Putin's counteroffensive drags on? Will we start seeing North Koreans get captured as the war heads into its 3rd year?
Russia needs help. After close to 34 months of the special military operation in Ukraine, a desperate Russia has decided to call upon its alliances directly to try and make some headway in a war that has them stymied. No, not China, though the Asian nation has been practically invaluable for Putin, helping him bypass the economic sanctions imposed by most of the Western world and allowing his war machine to keep its lights on as the war raged on. We're talking about the secretive but volatile nation of North Korea. In coming to the aid of one of its few international partners, North Korea has directly answered their call by sending over 10,000 of its troops to Kursk, the site of Russia's biggest defeat during the war. But while the North Korean government is expecting to gain much prestige and valuable military experience by sending its troops into an active war zone, the soldiers themselves are unlikely to receive any gratitude for those actions. In fact, they'll be lucky to even be acknowledged for their effort. You see, the North Korean troops that are believed to be stationed in Kursk are unlikely to be that valuable to Russia. Even worse, Ukrainian intelligence suggests that a vast majority of these troops are expected to only receive a few months of training and die during the war, accomplishing practically nothing for either Russia or North Korea in the meantime. In fact, it could be said that the fate of the North Korean soldiers who were transported to Kursk is even more grim than that of North Korean prisoners in the country's labor camps. To get a sense of the scale of North Korean labor camps or prisons and the conditions inside, we can take a look at extensive reports made by the United Nations. The reports were made by collaborating stories from eyewitness accounts and interviews with former prisoners who were lucky enough to survive the ordeal and be set free, or escape the prisons altogether, and then managed to flee North Korea entirely. The most recent such report came from July 2024, which was compiled with 183 interviews between 2015 and 2023. This means that just around 23 people per year managed to escape the labor camps in North Korea. Of course, it's highly likely that the actual number of people who survive the camps themselves is higher, as we have no reliable metrics on the number of prisoners held in the camps, their full capacities, or other relevant figures. However, the interviews that the UN did manage to conduct with the relatively few survivors paints a disgustingly grim picture of the conditions found in the camps. The UN Human Rights Chief Volker Turk commented that the prisoners are forced to work in intolerable conditions, often in dangerous sectors with the absence of pay, free choice, ability to leave, protection, medical care, time off, food and shelter. They are placed under constant surveillance, regularly beaten, while women are exposed to continuing risks of sexual violence. The treatment of the prisoners could be described as separated into 6 different categories: labor detention, i.e. forced labor in the camp, mandatory and compulsory jobs assigned by the state government, which often withheld any pay, military conscription, shock brigade service, mobilized work within the state, and mobilized work abroad. While the UN report outlines the various differences between these types of work, such as the exact minutiae of how the work is performed and how each prisoner can be filled in to a specific role, all of these 6 categories have more things in common than not. For example, the reports indicated that practically every instance of forced labor, whether it was in a camp or on site, was predicated on the fact that the laborers would be subjected to extremely harsh conditions, oftentimes having practically no room or privacy. The food situation was especially dire, with some escapees reporting that they could be fed as little as 3 ounces of corn per day. The forced labor and the prevailing food shortages are compounded by the fact that some sentences in North Korea transcend familial bonds and generations. Prisoners could be put there based on what their close family members have done, and entire generations of a family could serve lifelong sentences in labor camps together, practically becoming enemies to each other in the process. The guards would ration food so strictly and create divides among the prisoners to the point where it would become more advantageous to report on your family and curry favor with the guards in the process. Take the infamous story of Shin In-gwen, which showed that children were particularly affected by the brainwashing and mental and physical torment that went on in the camps. Shin, who was actually allowed to be born inside the camp as a way for the guards to supposedly reward his father for his work skills, accepted life in the prison so strongly that he considered the guards to be above his own family. When his mother and brother made plans to escape, Shin informed the guards, who then executed them. The scope of mistreatment in the prison camps was primarily founded on the practically endless malnutrition that the people inside were subjected to. Faced with the prospect of eating far below what was normal for a human, prisoners would quickly grow jealous or hateful of other prisoners, as if they were in competition for the already meager food supplies. The malnutrition was combined with torture and physical mistreatment that the UN openly called a breach of basic human rights in its reports. These factors often combined to make the prisoners practically shells of their former selves. An interview with a former prisoner indicated that they could be starved to the point where they could lose dozens of pounds in a month. One prisoner's weight was estimated to have dropped from 132 pounds to just 82. The diet, which was primarily composed of corn feed and rice bran, was compared, unfavorably, to animal feed, which forced many prisoners to subsist on eating rats, cockroaches, and other pests that could be found in the agriculture-related complexes of the camps. The sheer scale of horror that went on in North Korean camps, especially before the turn of the century, will likely remain a hotly contested subject for decades. However, outside pressure from the UN, which was also likely compounded by the pressure from North Korea's 2 allies and neighbors, China and Russia, has led to conditions in prison camps slightly improving over time. This is corroborated by an interview with a prisoner who was in one of the camps not once but twice, the first time in 2000 and the second in 2017. His treatment, although horrible when viewed through an objective lens, showed that North Korean prisoners likely had much better chances of survival in recent years than they did at the turn of the century, even if those odds were far below what would be considered normal in civilized society. Specifically, the interviewee went as far as to call some of his treatment during his second imprisonment term a no-stress environment. This goes in line with the continuous mental and physical abuse leading to prisoners normalizing and acclimating to their captors' behavior.
In essence, when they were deprived of so much, even smaller mercies, such as being given blankets during winter, which saw temperatures drop to -10 degrees Fahrenheit in North Korea, were seen as significant improvements in their well-being, if you stretch the meaning of the phrase well-being to its limits. As mentioned, work camps aren't the only way North Korea imposes forced labor. Mandatory military service in the country can be a grueling prospect for the citizens as well. The state mandate requires every man to serve for 8 years and every woman to serve for 5 years. This is even an improvement from the previous requirements, which were a decade for men and 7 years for women. The astronomical mandatory military service duration, which applied to the vast majority of the population, has led to North Korea having one of the largest militaries in the world, with 1.32 million active service personnel. Let's compare this number to the military power of the strongest nations in the world. China has roughly 2 million active troops, India has around 1.4 million active soldiers, and the US has slightly over 1.32 million. But the actual total population puts things into a much different perspective. China and India have over 1.4 billion people, and the US has around 330 million residents. North Korea, in comparison, has only 26 million people. This means that North Korea is arguably one of the most militarized nations in the world. Due to the lengthy mandatory military service requirements, it also has a significant percentage of people who have gone through military service and can be drafted in times of war. Some estimates suggest that North Korea could draft roughly 8 million people during wartime, practically a third of its population. While the numbers of active personnel indicate that North Korea has a thriving army, the reality doesn't align with that sentiment. The government treats military conscripts only slightly better than people in work camps, expecting soldiers to provide a regular and steady supply of free labor to the state, often in construction and agricultural work. The environments in which the work is done are practically no different from labor camps, as the UN reports have suggested that soldiers often lack basic human necessities, including enough food, water, shelter, and even healthcare. Some UN reports indicate that tuberculosis is particularly present among the conscripts, and the country as a whole is listed as high risk for the disease by the World Health Organization in 2023. North Korea experiences relatively frequent spikes in tuberculosis and other infectious diseases due to the country's lack of access to advanced healthcare. Some programs that were supposed to have provided steady import of TB drugs have stopped operating after the pandemic, only exacerbating the problem. With the combination of grueling work, poor life quality, and lack of access to basic human needs, the average North Korean soldier is likely going to be extremely ill-equipped to handle an actual combat situation. And this is not even counting the fact the country has practically no modern training capabilities. The last time North Korea was in active conflict was in 1953, when the Korean War stopped and the Korean Demilitarized Zone was drawn up by the two inheritor countries and their allies. Since then, North Korea's army has practically been raised by the equipment, methodology, and ideology of the Soviet Union, a country that ceased to exist in 1991. In fact, most of North Korea's military equipment stems from Soviet times, including their meager supplies of tanks, aircraft, infantry support vehicles, and artillery. These vehicles have likely been maintained and perhaps even slightly upgraded from their baseline designs when they were imported from the Soviet Union. However, that still leaves most of North Korea's military equipment arsenal at 40 to 80 years old, putting it considerably behind modern militaries or even those of developing countries. The combination of old vehicles and lack of actual combat experience means that new North Korean troops are at the mercy of whatever training the government can scrounge up from its two neighboring allies. And considering that both Russia and China have limited their investments in the country over the past few decades, it's unlikely that they've created many joint exercises or overhauled training methodologies. All of this indicates that North Korean soldiers are significantly behind the times compared to Western equivalents, using obsolete equipment and tactics that likely have no place in modern wars. But what does this mean for the troops that the country has shipped to Kursk in November? Well, North Korea has likely sent some of its best troops to fight Putin's war. These soldiers are likely to stem from the military's more elite units, those with better access to training and who likely haven't undergone the full extent of torture indicative of prison camps and mandatory military service labor. Even if the soldiers haven't volunteered for duty, they have likely been pressured to join the Kursk units under the threat of their families being put in labor camps. As mentioned, North Korea is big on generational familial punishment. This likely means that the soldiers will be monitored for their activity and behavior in the Russian military, and are going to be put on a short leash, so to speak, in terms of what they can and can't do. Some soldiers might consider the fighting in Kursk to be beneficial to their social standing and be willing to go into combat. Russia is paying North Korea for every soldier they receive the same salary they would a native Russian conscript, $2,000 per month, which is likely hundreds of times over the average North Korean wage.
Even if the North Korean government keeps 90% of the earnings the soldiers make, that's still a sizable chunk of money that might go to the soldiers' families back home. In some cases, even their death would bring the family significant social standing and glory in North Korea, which could indicate that North Korea might even start sending more soldiers in the long run. But regardless of the circumstances that brought the North Korean soldiers to Kursk and the potential benefits they could reap from the situation, they're still going to face potentially insurmountable problems when fighting against Ukraine. First off, there's the fact that North Korean soldiers likely don't speak Russian at all. Ukrainian intelligence has caught communication between Russian soldiers that indicates that the Russian natives simply don't know what to do with their North Korean allies when the latter are unable to comprehend more than the bare minimum of both verbal and non-verbal commands. The same report suggests that North Korea will use senior officers or dedicated translators to act as go-betweens, but this is unlikely to have a significant result on unit cohesion and cooperation. When push comes to shove, it's possible that Russian soldiers would likely give their North Korean colleagues commands that would actively put them in harm's way and have them act as decoys or bait. It could lead to mixed Russian-North Korean units having desperately low survival rates, especially for North Korean soldiers. Secondly, there's the matter of a lack of training. Reports from the front indicate that Ukraine still hasn't faced large numbers of North Korean troops in Kursk, suggesting that Russia is still somewhat willing to prepare them for the inevitable onslaught. However, the technological and tactical disparity between the two militaries is likely beyond something that can be fixed in a few months. Pair this with the fact that North Koreans would need to be trained by North Korean officers due to language barriers, and the training regime is likely going to be shoddy and ineffective at best. In particular, North Korean troops will have the hardest time dealing with the emergent tactics that have been developed and perhaps even perfected during the war in Ukraine: drone warfare. The Ukrainian military has started using drones in every type of military altercation, from short-range infantry-based tactics to mid-range artillery barrages to long-range targeted strikes deep into Russian territory. The extent, scale, and variety of drones that Ukraine uses have allowed the country to practically bypass the need for a large navy and air force. In fact, the Russian Black Sea Fleet was forced to retreat to Crimea in November 2022, in part due to newly developed sea-deployed kamikaze drones. Even worse, Ukraine has combined multiple types of drones into entire units, utilizing long-range drones as eyes in the sky and remote relays for short-range first-person view drones. This means that Ukraine can devastate Russian infantry with negligible risk and repercussions to its own army, significantly altering the terms of engagement in its favor. The North Korean military simply isn't ready or trained to fight in a war of this scale and technological dependency. The soldiers, who are unlikely to be even properly trained in infantry-based tactics, are going to be caught completely off guard by Ukraine leveraging drones in Kursk. They will be sitting ducks against an enemy that can target them from the sky, chase them inside reinforced areas, and even destroy armored vehicles with a single, well-positioned kamikaze drone. And as mentioned, the Russian soldiers and officers are likely going to take full advantage of this, and not to the benefit of North Korean troops. Unfortunately, the most likely scenario in combat engagements in Kursk involving North Korean soldiers will see them being used as human bait. The Russians will likely separate the Russian and North Korean soldiers, giving the latter minimal defensive equipment, guidance, or even training to improve their chances of survival. Then those soldiers will be left to their own devices, in the hopes that Ukraine will focus its drones on the North Koreans. The Russian units could then try to spot the Ukrainian drone operator command centers and target them with long-range strikes, something that might not work if Ukraine manages to fully develop its drone technology to outrange common Soviet artillery. In essence, North Koreans are likely going to die by the thousands if they're ever fully deployed in Kursk. The Ukrainian Ministry of Defense and Military Intelligence suggests a survival rate of around 10% in the long run. While there are no exact figures about the survival rate inside North Korean labor camps, it's estimated to be 75%. That's much higher than the expected survival rate of the North Korean soldiers in Russia. With Russia steadily losing more and more soldiers, it's likely a matter of when, rather than if, North Koreans will be forcibly deployed en masse. Ukraine claims it's mowing down Russian troops at a rate of over 1,300 per day, which is an increase from the Russian daily casualties during the disastrous summer campaign and the initial invasion of Kursk. At these rates, the first batch of 10,000 North Koreans that's stationed in Kursk might be decimated within a few months. And there's another possibility that could be equally harrowing for the North Korean troops. They might be used as construction and testing crews. With the mandatory military service requirements in North Korea already requiring construction work, This could lead to Russia utilizing those soldiers to dig trenches and reinforce front lines. This could lead to a significant drop in earning potential, prestige, or even access to facilities that the Russian military provides to its soldiers. In short, the North Korean troops would be treated worse than Russia's own conscripts, who were left by themselves on their posts in Kursk and surrendered when the first wave of Ukrainian soldiers came their way. If that repeats, the North Korean soldiers could be treated much worse, not by Ukrainians who capture them, but by the North Korean government, who might consider them defectors and punish their families. Alternatively, the North Korean troops might just be used as shock troops for the Russian and North Korean military to test weapons or defensive systems, particularly in an attempt to counter Ukraine's drone advantages. This could mean that they might be actively used as disposable targets more than the native Russians. Putin would get more soldiers to use in his war against Ukraine, and North Korea would get valuable experience with modern tactics and equipment that it's undoubtedly receiving from Russia in return. All things considered, while some soldiers might think of their deployment to Russia as an honor, in reality, they are likely going to be treated more like cattle moved to slaughter, and Russia aims to fully recover the territory it lost in Kursk by the time the talk of peace agreements enters the picture. In that case, Putin will undoubtedly deploy the North Korean troops sooner rather than later. For many of those soldiers, their first encounter with the Ukrainian military will also be their last. But what do you think? Will North Korean troops actually make a difference in the war?